Welcome, everyone, to what promises to be a fun-filled and action-packed debate on awesome theistic evidence. The resolution under debate today is this House believes that the awesome theistic evidence response successfully undermines major objections to theistic arguments. So the awesome theistic evidence response is just an appeal to various thought experiments, which is meant to show that several prominent objections to various arguments for God prove too much. Those objections, if they were successful in the case of fine-tuning or psychophysical harmony or appeal to the applicability of mathematics, if they were successful there, they also seem to spill over and imply they prove too much. They would show that there's no possible evidence for God's existence. But we can see that there are certain possible empirical observations which would constitute evidence for theism, and therefore these objections must fail. So that's the basic idea. I'll go through that in more detail in my opening statement. To briefly just mention the names of the 9 distinguished philosophers that are debating this resolution. We have Noah McKay, Paul Draper, Kevin Scharp, Brian Cutter, Nathan Bray, Alex Malpass, Travis Dumsday, and myself, Miles Donahue. So the basic format, we will have 9 opening statements, 5 minutes each, from the 4 philosophers who are in favor of the resolution, and then the 5 or so philosophers who are against. Some people are in middling positions, and that's okay. And then we will move to cross-examination, where each speaker will be cross-examined for 10 minutes. They will each be in the hot seat for a maximum of 10 minutes, for a total of 90 minutes of structured cross-examination time. And then depending on how we're feeling at that point, we have slotted in about 20 minutes of open discussion, and we'll see it's there if we feel like we need it, and if not, we can then move straight into closing statements, where we'll have 5-minute closing statements from each group. So one person from each group will be elected to then give a 5-minute closing statement, and then that will close us out. So, without further ado, we move to opening statements, which is me. Start with me. In my opening statement, I'm going to set the stage by explaining in more detail what awesome theistic evidence, or like the ATE response, is, and defend one instance of it against a prominent objection, my favorite skeptical objection, the stalking horse objection. And specifically, I'll talk about it as an objection to the fine-tuning argument for theism, but my reply will generalize to other theistic arguments as well. So, some terminology. Awesome theistic evidence, ATE evidence, no, just ATE, evidence is already in there, is commonly cited cases as they're ostensibly extreme and obvious possible empirical observations that would be evidence for God's existence if we had them. So, for example, the stars realigning to spell out the first 12 verses of the Gospel of John in Greek. Peering into a microscope and seeing "made by God" etched into the side of every molecule. However, the physics works out on a molecule having something etched into it. Or one that I will add is the second return of Christ, of Jesus Christ, and his subsequent millennial reign on earth. If the idea here is that in each of these cases, if you were party to these observations, you would have evidence for theism, for God's existence. So then theistic arguments, the resolution makes mention of standard or main theistic arguments, which I'll refer to as fine-tuning et al. As a catch-all term. These would be things like the fine-tuning argument, the psychophysical harmony argument, the nomological argument, which is the idea that the order inherent in the laws of nature is evidence for God's existence. The argument from the applicability of mathematics, that the rich mathematical structure of the universe is evidence for God's existence, and other empirical arguments for theism. So against these arguments, there are actually overlapping objections. There are a few families of objections that seem to apply to all of them. So for example, take the stalking horse objection. Here the idea is that just as theism is a specific version of the general design hypothesis, that there is a designer of the universe, so too we should compare theism against a specific version of naturalism. So Alex Malpass, for instance, has proposed augmented naturalism, the hypothesis that the universe has a disposition to incline towards constants that are life-permitting. So this would arise in the context of the fine-tuning argument for theism. That hypothesis, augmented naturalism, does seem to make fine-tuning for life just as likely as theism. And so the idea is that if the theist can opt for a specific version of the design hypothesis, namely theism, an all-powerful, all-knowing God, then so can the naturalist. But then fine-tuning is evidentially inert. It doesn't give us any reason to prefer theism to naturalism. Now, the ATE response goes like this. The general form is something like this. Premise 1. If objection X works in the case of fine-tuning et al., it would also imply that there is no possible evidence for theism. 2, there is possible evidence for theism. And here enters the awesome theistic evidence that I delineated earlier. 3, therefore, objection X does not work in the case of fine-tuning et al., these standard arguments. So in the case of the stalking horse, I contend that it overgeneralizes. It proves too much. Imagine standing outside of Jesus' tomb in 33 CE and seeing the stone roll away of its own accord, seemingly, and a radiant, beaming figure walk out from the tomb dressed in white. You speak with him, walk with him, eat with him, go with him into town where he meets others as well. Clearly, this would be at least some evidence for theism over naturalism. You ought to increase your credence in theism compared with naturalism, just even a little bit. But it would seem that one could press with equal force the stalking horse maneuver, as we did in the case of fine-tuning, namely with this hypothesis. The universe has a disposition to allow for spontaneous resurrections of crucified victims in the year 33 CE in Jerusalem. But this would obviously do nothing to undermine the rationality of your inference to theism. And so the objection proves too much. If it undermines the inference here, it seems parallel. It undermines the inference in the case of fine-tuning, or vice versa. And so if we still do have evidence here for theism, then it can't work in the case of fine-tuning either, is the idea. Now, in my debate with Alex, he replied by biting the bullet and at least implying that witnessing the resurrection of Jesus wouldn't be any evidence at all for theism over naturalism. Instead, it might be evidence, say, for aliens or some other exotic but still natural hypothesis. But you can, if you'd like, believe in aliens if you witness the resurrection of Jesus, but I think that most of us can see that that would be a wildly implausible inference. But I won't repeat what I said in my debate with Malpass. Instead, we can just shift to talking about any other possible empirical observations. Pick anything. Miraculous healings when we pray to God to have our prayers answered. Ancient prophecies being fulfilled. Visions from God, for example, telling us how future events will unfold, and then they do unfold in exactly the detail in which they were conveyed. The point is, the stalking horse objection seems to imply that we can have no possible empirical evidence for theism over naturalism. For any logically possible observation, there will always be parity between theism and naturalism if you grant the machinery and the logic of the stalking horse objection, but that's a radical and deeply implausible thesis. Let me check in. What are we looking at on time? We're done. Okay, there you go.
All right, perfect. So, yeah, whoever wants to continue the case, go ahead.
I think I'm supposed to be next. Okay, so I also agree with the motion. It seems to me immensely intuitively plausible that if we were to observe evidence of the kind labeled as awesome theistic evidence in the opening statement of Miles, like messages in the stars and the like, this would be very strong evidence for the existence of God. And I think this powerful intuitive datum serves as a check on objections to design arguments like the fine-tuning argument or the psychophysical harmony argument. And in particular, if you're giving an objection, you should ask yourself, if this objection is successful, would it equally show that awesome theistic evidence wouldn't be evidence for God? If it would, then that shows that the objection must go wrong somewhere. It doesn't diagnose exactly where it goes wrong, but it shows that the objection must go wrong somewhere. So I think that this thought experiment undermines many well-known objections to fine-tuning and similar arguments. In the interest of time, I'll just give a couple examples. Miles gave the example of the stalking horse objection. So here's another one. So some object to the fine-tuning argument by saying, look, you can't assign probabilities to one-time events like the setting of the fundamental constants of the universe or the initial conditions of the universe. The background thought is that probabilities need to be justified empirically by reference to observed frequencies, but it's not like we get to observe lots of universes and see how their constant values vary and see how their initial conditions vary. So we can't justify the claim that it was improbable that on naturalism that the constants would be within the life permitting range, or that the initial conditions would be whatever they are. Enter the awesome theistic evidence reply. We can see that this objection must go wrong somewhere. It proves too much, because it would equally imply that if we found that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out a message, like made by God with love, we wouldn't be able to say that it's evidence for God, but it clearly is. Or to take an example involving the constants, suppose we found that some very central fundamental physical constant, when you formulate it in binary, turns out to be the ASCII code for the Gospel of John. I claim pretty clearly that would be strong evidence for theism, but if this objection is correct, that it wouldn't be, so there must be something wrong with the objection. Another example, so some respond to design arguments by saying that, look, no matter what marvels we find in the natural world, naturalism is always going to come out more plausible at the end of the day due to its relative simplicity. So the thought is we can compare two hypotheses. On the one hand, the naturalistic view that we just have like the natural world is all there is, and it's got certain fundamental laws and constants and initial conditions, to the theistic view that you've got a universe with those specific laws, constants, and initial conditions, plus a God behind it that created it. So the thought is, look, those two views are going to predict our evidence just as well. They're going to be alike with respect to the natural world, the observed features of the natural world, but the theistic view will be more complex and thereby less probable. So naturalism is bound to come out ahead at the end of the day, no matter what marvels we find. Enter the awesome theistic evidence reply. We can see that this response must go wrong somewhere, because it would equally imply that if we found that the initial conditions spelled out a message, or if the interior of the atom spelled the prologue of the Gospel of John, that we should equally favor naturalism. Clearly that's wrong, so we can conclude that the objection must go wrong somewhere. How am I doing on time? Okay, I'll mention one final example. So some object to fine-tuning psychophysical harmony et al. By reference to worries about distributing probabilities over infinite probability spaces. So, maybe you've got a constant that seems to be within a pretty narrow range of life-permitting values, but maybe there's infinitely many values it could conceivably have taken, and there's maybe no uniquely natural privileged probability measure that we can put over that infinite space of possibilities. And because there's no uniquely natural privileged measure, you might argue that we're not justified in assigning any specific low probability to the constants taking the life-permitting values conditional on naturalism. And so, we can't mount a Bayesian argument against naturalism or for design. Again, I think the same thing could be said in the face of putative awesome theistic evidence, which suggests at least a challenge to this objection. So if we found in the interior of the atom the prologue to the Gospel of John, someone could say, look, we can't say that this was unlikely on naturalism because there's infinitely many possible structures we could have observed within the interior of the atom. There's no uniquely natural privileged probability measure over that infinite space, and so we just can't justify the claim that the observed structure was unlikely. So clearly there's something wrong with that objection in the face of this particular example. So the challenge to the original objection would be to explain what the relevant difference is between the objection in the case of awesome theistic evidence and the objection in the case of fine-tuning.
Okay, so I want to talk about two more examples of objections to theistic arguments that I think are vulnerable to the ATE response. The first is the divine psychology objection. In order for some proposition to count as evidence for theism, that proposition has to be likelier given theism than given atheism. But, the objection goes, we can't know for any proposition whether it's more likely given theism than given atheism. That has exceptions. But in general, propositions about empirical observations, we can't know those are likelier given theism than given atheism. Why not? Well, because in order to know that, we would have to have some grasp of God's psychology. But God is a transcendent being. He's so alien that we shouldn't be confident in our judgments about what he likely would or wouldn't do. And so, take the fine-tuning data, for example. We shouldn't be confident that God is more likely to create a fine-tuned universe than a fine-tuned universe is to exist just due to chance, for instance, because we don't have a sufficient grasp of God's psychology. I think this objection is vulnerable to the ATE response. Why? Well, because notice that the reasoning I gave initially was schematic. I just said for any empirical proposition P, we aren't justified in thinking it's likelier given theism than given atheism. But that means we can substitute any empirical observation we want for P, including the awesome theistic evidence that Miles reviewed at the beginning of the debate. Now, that tells us there's something wrong with the divine psychology objection. It doesn't diagnose the problem. I'm just going to offer a diagnosis briefly. I think we can have at least some reasonable expectations about God's behavior just by unpacking the notion of a limitless agent. So theism, at bottom, I think, is the proposition that the fundamental reality is a limitless agent, an agent that's unlimited in knowledge and power. Well, the notion of an agent, I think, involves at least the following. An agent is a being that acts for reasons. And I think that can justify at least some modest expectations about what an agent would do. An agent is more likely to act in ways that are intelligible, for which we can see reasons, and comparably less likely to act in ways that are unintelligible or in ways for which we can't see reasons. Compare this to the notion of an organism, right? Suppose there's some being, you don't know anything about it except that it's an organism. Well, just by knowing it's an organism, you can have some very modest expectations about how it's going to behave. You can know it's more likely to seek shelter than to flee from shelter, for example. It's more likely to seek out food rather than flee from food. It's more likely than not to engage in activities that contribute to its own internal maintenance, right? You don't have to know much about the relevant being psychology in order to have those reasonable, modest expectations. And I think that the same goes for God. Now, I'd like to briefly talk about one other argument, Hume's famous argument against miracles. So Hume famously argued the strongest possible proof you can have for something is uniform experience. So if in all of your experience a proposition is true, that's the strongest possible proof you can have for that proposition. But Hume says a miracle by definition is a violation of the laws of nature. And laws of nature, by definition, are propositions that are supported by uniform experience. So it follows that we always have the strongest possible proof against the claim that a miracle occurred. And that means no human testimony could ever be sufficient to establish a miracle. I think this is also vulnerable to something like the ATE response, because I can imagine testimonial evidence that would be sufficient to establish that a miracle occurred. Suppose you're in Jerusalem and you walk around and absolutely everyone you talk to says they've seen Jesus alive. You've talked to physicians who have examined his wounds. You talk to ex-Pharisees who say they saw him ascend into heaven and subsequently converted. But we can go even further than this, because although Hume restricts his conclusion to testimony, I actually think that's unjustified. If uniform experience is the strongest possible proof of a proposition, as Hume claims, then it seems like no evidence would be sufficient to establish that a miracle occurred. So even if you were to witness the resurrection of Christ for yourself, Hume could equally say, well, look, if that were true, it would be a violation of the law of nature, and we have the strongest possible proof that there are no violations of the law of nature. So at best, this evidence canceled out. But I think that's manifestly wrong.
Awesome. So whoever is next in the queue to defend Miles's side of the proposition can go ahead. So I believe that is Travis.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm Travis Dumsday. I teach philosophy at Concordia University in Alberta. Yeah, I won't try to add too much to the argument made so far. I'll maybe just make a couple of quick comments about how to situate this debate within the context of some larger debates or some other debates in philosophy of religion. So one thing I would point out was that I think the atheist who wants to make the claim that there is no possible empirical evidence that could support theism over naturalism, and the person who wants to make that claim in order to defeat fine-tuning arguments, I think ultimately they're shooting themselves in the foot, right? This is going to be counterproductive in terms of the larger cumulative case argument for atheism. Why is that? Well, because I think one of the best arguments for atheism is the problem of divine hiddenness, right? If God is real, why doesn't God make his reality more patently obvious to everyone, right? Why doesn't God give everybody better evidence, right? The thing is, though, in order for the argument, the problem of divine hiddenness, in order for that argument to go through successfully, of course, it has to be possible for God to make his existence evident and evident to everyone in a way that's rationally indubitable, right? That it cannot be rationally questioned. So, in other words, in order for the problem of divine hiddenness to be run successfully in favor of atheism, you have to suppose that it is in principle possible for God to give people adequate evidence of his existence. And so, if in order to run this present objection to the fine-tuning argument, you need to deny that, you're going to end up undermining the problem of divine hiddenness and therefore undermining one of the core arguments for atheism in the current philosophy of religion literature. So I think this is just dialectically a really bad move to try to make, irrespective of sort of the independent merits of the argument. So that's just a bit, but by way of a bit of additional kind of stage setting, looking at some broader implications of all this. Another point I'd make very briefly, though, just to further complicate the issue, is I think we need to distinguish between empirical evidence for theism versus empirical evidence for non-naturalism. Right. So if the two competing hypotheses that we're entertaining is something like Judeo-Christian theism versus metaphysical naturalism, I mean, metaphysical naturalism entails atheism, right? If the only kind of reality is physical reality, then of course there are no gods or souls or supernatural beings of any kind. But in principle, you can be an atheist non-naturalist, right? You can be someone who rejects naturalism, but still believes someone who rejects theism, but still believes in certain kinds of supernatural entities. And you also want to be cognizant of the fact that just because you have good empirical evidence against naturalism, that does not equate to good empirical evidence for theism. And so this complicates some of the dialectics surrounding miracles and some of the standard examples I think that we sort of worked with in this area, right? Because if you're talking not to an atheist naturalist, but someone like a neo-pagan, right? The neo-pagan is going to look at the empirical evidence for miracles or for the resurrection of Jesus or something like this, and they'll say, well, sure, this is good empirical evidence that there's more to reality than the physical, but that's not really good empirical evidence that the Judeo-Christian God exists. Maybe this empirical evidence can be equally well accounted for by reference to other lower-level supernatural entities, right? Maybe we don't have to reference an all-powerful, all-knowing being to explain this data. We can reference a series of less powerful, finite, small g gods who are engaging in these miracles. So I do think we need to distinguish between what would count as good empirical evidence against naturalism versus what would count as good empirical evidence specifically for theism. And I suspect that's a nuance that's not really being captured in some of this fine-tuning literature. So I'll just leave that as my second kind of qualifying comment. Thanks.
Am I next?
I think, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, I thought that Brian and Noah did a great job of making some of the main points you'd want to make, and Travis did a really good job of then supplementing that. So I'll just add a couple of points in the that are maybe some things that people wouldn't naturally think of right away. So kind of following up on Travis's second point, you have to be really careful in choosing your example of awesome evidence, because some of the examples that I've heard, a giant cross in the sky, or verses from the Quran written on molecules, or things like that. one could argue that that's actually evidence against omnitheism. I was taking our hypothesis today to be omnitheism. Omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good creator of the universe hypothesis. And because I think that such a being would be very much opposed to Islam and Christianity, for tons of reasons that I won't go into. John Schellenberg, in his recent book on classical Christianity, gives some of those reasons. So it might be actually extremely unlikely that sort of thing would happen. If extremely, extremely unlikely that such a thing, that those sorts of fantastical events would happen on the assumption that omnitheism is true. So I prefer, I want to go with an example that doesn't get into those issues. And obviously those issues could be debated on both sides. But I'd like maybe something like Cleanthes's voice from the clouds example from part 3 of Hume's dialogues. So where you have a voice from the clouds that speaks to everybody on earth in their own language and gives a profound message, seemingly far beyond any wisdom humans have come up with so far, something like that. Then that sort of evidence would seem then, on my view, to be clearly more likely on omnitheism than on its denial. Even though its denial could include, there's other possible explanations. It could be, we're being a trick played on us by powerful and intelligent aliens, or it could be that we're in a simulation, some version of the simulation hypothesis. But those would take up such a small amount of the probability space for the denial of theism, and the large amount would be taken up by hypotheses that would make it much, much less likely that you'd have this voice from the clouds if they were true than if theism was true. So overall, that's going to end up being strong evidence for omnitheism. It's not that that this voice is very likely given omnitheism, but it's much more unlikely. In fact, it's probably very unlikely given theism that this voice would take place, but even more, many times more unlikely given atheism, and thus it would raise the odds of theism in favor of theism being true by a large factor. That's my the second point I'd like to make. Hopefully I have time. Is notice that if E is evidence for theism, then its absence is evidence against theism. So all these instances of awesome evidence we're talking about are things that actually are false, right? We don't hear the voice from the clouds. And so that means that, just by simple math, that they must lower the probability of theism. So you might think, is this some kind of problem for the side that I'm on here? Not really, because although there has to be asymmetry with respect to if E is evidence for H, then not E has to be evidence against it, in the sense of lowering or raising the probability. Although there's symmetry there doesn't have to be symmetry in the strength of the evidence, in the sense of how many times greater it makes the odds in favor of the statement being true. So then in this case, we have an asymmetry where the absence would be very weak evidence, because although it would be fantastically likely that you would not have the voice in the clouds if atheism is true, it would be very, very likely you wouldn't have it even if theism is true. And so the ratio there is a very small number. So while its presence would give us strong evidence for theism, its absence would give us very weak evidence against theism. That's it.
Awesome. Perfect. So now transitioning to, I think, the other side of the ledger, or the people who take a different view with respect to the motion, we will start with Alex.
Okay, thanks very much. So I guess, firstly, just thanks for having me on such a distinguished panel. So one I guess I don't really feel worthy to be on, but let's just keep going with the premise anyway. And I think I'm not. I think I'm genuinely open to changing my mind about this. So it's not a hill I'm particularly prepared to die on. But let me try and say a few things. What my view is at the moment. So it seems to me that you can say something like theism and naturalism are kind of very broad kind of categories in which you can have lots of different, more specific fleshings out of what those mean. So, for instance, maybe we say something at the most broad level, something like theism means that there's a supernatural creator of everything that exists, and naturalism means that there isn't a supernatural creator for everything that exists. Something very broad like that. If we call that bare theism and bare naturalism, then I think it's relatively uncontroversial to just point out that each of those theories doesn't really generate very much in terms of expectations. Right? I'm not given bare theism. I don't know why I would expect to see, for instance, suffering as opposed to non-suffering. I mean, I'm not telling you what this creature is like, that it might be particularly evil or indifferent or good. It's just that there's a creator of the universe. I think I'm still going to have basically no idea what the universe would be like, just given that input. In the same way, if I just tell you that there isn't a supernatural creator of the universe, that doesn't tell me what the universe is like either. So both of those just don't really do anything in terms of generating expectations. And therefore, when we come to look at some evidence and say, well, is this evidence likely on bare theism as opposed to bare naturalism? Whatever the evidence is going to basically be the same. It's just nothing, no evidence tells in favor of either of those hypotheses. So basically, because they don't generate any expectations, I think that's why no evidence stands in favor or against either of them. But then my impression of thinking about fine-tuning arguments, I guess, in particular, was that sometimes what you see seems like an apples to oranges comparison when we look at which types of hypotheses we're comparing against the evidence. So sometimes you'll see quite a fleshed out theistic hypothesis, which is that God has such and such psychological state, such and such power and whatnot. So we fill in the details of what God's like in quite a lot of detail. And then sometimes the detail is left quite sparse when it comes to naturalism, just something like there's a single universe naturalism or something like that. And then I kind of felt like, well, no surprise, given the disparity between those two hypotheses, that one of them generates expectations that the other one doesn't. Of course, if we're saying there's an all-powerful good God, then it's surprising if I see suffering or whatever. It's not surprising if I see constants finely tuned for life, that type of thing. Especially when we're comparing it to a naturalist hypothesis, it doesn't have any details filled in. That's not really telling me anything about what I should expect to see. So then it's no surprise then if I find some evidence that the theistic hypothesis kind of fits better with than the naturalistic hypothesis, just a kind of apples to oranges comparison. And I could do the same thing by cooking up a naturalistic hypothesis that's like Leslie axiarchism or something, where the natural universe tends towards the good, and then just compare that to bare theism, where it doesn't say anything about what God's psychological states are like, what his desires or beliefs are like. And then I think, fair enough. Then in that case, I think I can sort of win the argument in a trivial way again by saying, this evidence fits better with axiarchism than it does bare theism. But nobody should be particularly impressed with those types of conclusions, right? What we want would be like an apples to oranges comparison is not very interesting. But then an apples to apples comparison will end in a draw because they're both apples. So, and there must be something wrong with this type of reasoning. I'm open to being schooled about this because it feels, on the one hand, too quick, and the other hand, too powerful. So there's no way that could be right. I must have done something wrong. But the little bit of reasoning that I just went through then seemed quite plausible to me. So that's how I think of the stalking horse hypothesis. As I've got like 1 minute left, I guess maybe I'll just try and say something about maybe what the reply here is that, well, the hypotheses are like unequal when it comes to things like simplicity or intrinsic probability, that type of thing. And that may be true, maybe. I wonder if what's going on in my head when I'm thinking about it, well, why am I more inclined to say something like, well, the universe is very big and very old, and maybe there are really super powerful aliens, right? It feels like not a big jump for me. I already think the universe is quite like that. So it's a small addition, whereas because I don't think God exists, it feels like a big addition for me to get there. So maybe my background knowledge is what's playing the difference here. And maybe my background knowledge is idiomatic to me. And that swamps the sort of simplicity stuff. Like I sort of don't care that if it's a simple addition because I'm already committed to a bunch of stuff. And the very, very last thing, and if that's right, I wonder if these extreme epistemic tests are actually very good if what happens is the person's background knowledge ends up playing a kind of dominating role in their evaluation of these edge cases. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, perfect. So considering that Kevin will deliver the last opening statement, I will now proceed with my opening statement. So first of all, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear everybody's opening statements thus far. The response that I'm going to give, or the argument that I'm going to give, is rather conditional in nature. So it's not meant to show that all theists, are going to have this problem, but just some of them. And one of them is actually on this panel, so I think it's going to be very interesting. So here's my argument. Premise 1, if theists don't think that hiddenness is confirming evidence for atheism over theism, then those theists should not think that awesome theistic evidence is confirming evidence for theism. Premise 2, theists don't think that hiddenness is confirming evidence for atheism over theism. Therefore, theists should not think that awesome theistic evidence is confirming evidence for theism. Let's go to premise 1. Why should we think that that conditional is true? Well, I think that there's a key assumption here, which is that the situations are largely symmetrical. There's a parity between the two situations in question. That is to say, in both cases, we wonder whether God is the kind of being who would give such ostentatious displays of his existence, such flashy displays of his existence. So in the case of hiddenness, people like J.L. Schellenberg, what they're wondering is, well, why doesn't God make his existence more apparent such that we would mitigate the amount of non-resistant non-belief there is? And then it seems like an assumption that's being made with the awesome theistic evidence case is that, well, look, if we actually did see that evidence, then God is the kind of being that would produce that evidence. God is the kind of being that would produce that evidence. So we have a similar assumption on either side. Okay, so that's what's going to establish the parity thus far. What about premise 2? For premise 2, recall it says theists do not think that hiddenness is confirming evidence for atheism over theism. The assumption here is the mainline reply. So I take it that the mainline reply to the problem of hiddenness is to think that God has morally sufficient reasons for remaining hidden. And so to this extent, God is elusive. He bobs and he weaves. He isn't the type of person that would make his existence as obvious, as J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig say, as the nose on your face. In fact, it very well could be the case that if he were to do that, people would reject him. They wouldn't come into a loving relationship with him. And I'd like to bring up a quote by a fantastic philosopher named Travis Dumsday, where he says in 2012, it is worth recalling that there's something that all parties to the debate grant, namely that God's aim is supposed to be that of enabling us to have a positive relationship with him. His aim is not merely to convince us of his reality, but to allow for such a relationship. So the thought here is the following. Perhaps it's the case that by displaying such awesome theistic evidence, at least when we're in the context of the divine hiddenness argument, well, God isn't in the business of doing that. God isn't the type of being that would provide such evidence. But if that's the case, then it's difficult to see why such evidence would be confirmatory of theism. And so, as a result, the conclusion I think follows, which is that theists should not think that awesome theistic evidence is confirming evidence for theism. And so what I really just want to do here is point out the parallel structure. So zooming out, we can notice a key parallel between our strategy, or the strategy of resisting the problem of awesome theistic evidence, and the theist strategy for resisting the problem of divine hiddenness. Both the problem of divine hiddenness and the problem of awesome theistic evidence have a structure. The problem of divine hiddenness arises from the existence of non-resistant non-believers, which is surprising given theism. And theists such as Moreland and Craig and Moser and Dumsday respond to this problem by noting that we don't really have a good reason to think that God would reveal himself rather than remain elusive. Since naturalists struggle to ascertain whether God would or wouldn't want to reveal himself, they're hard-pressed to produce a problem of divine hiddenness that does not admit of an undercutting defeater. In other words, the naturalist struggles to produce a problem of divine hiddenness that does not require or rely on speculative claims about divine psychology. But what I want to claim is that really the theist is in the same boat. The theist is saying things like, well, in actual fact, God is the type of being that would display the awesome theistic evidence. But if Schellenberg is engaging in divine psychology when he says God would give such evidence, then the theist should be engaging in illicit divine psychology when they say that awesome theistic evidence would be confirmatory of theism. So the situations are largely symmetrical, right? So we have the problem of divine hiddenness, that's defeated by divine psychology. Then we have the problem of awesome theistic evidence, and that's defeated by divine psychology. And so in that way, the situations are symmetrical, and I think that we have a decent reply. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you. And then we'll go to Kevin. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. It's nice to be here and nice to be a part of the discussion. I'm just going to go through a couple of points about the main topic, and then hopefully I don't run over time. So, one, what's the divine psychology objection? The divine psychology objection is that you can't make assumptions about God or God's psychology in order to prove the existence of God, right? So God would create beings like us, or would, create consciousness, or create things that can feel awe, or whatever it is, the fine-tuning, life, God would want to do this or not want to do that. God would do such and such or not do such and such in certain circumstances. God would value X or Y. Anything that's going to be contingent there. I mean, if you can derive it from God's nature, then okay, fine. But by definition, but I think that actually causes more problems than it's worth. But adding on to God's nature is going to make all your other arguments be that much more difficult. But either way, that's the main point. So I think this cuts both ways. This does not just cut against the theist, it cuts against the atheist hard, right? We lose. I'm saying that I'm on the atheist side. I'm not a general atheist in the sense of believing that there are no gods at all. I think that's a silly position. Instead, I'm an atheist with respect to Christian gods that are familiar to us from human religions. Anyway, it cuts both ways, right? The broadly atheist position loses problem of evil, loses hiddenness. Those are that's good stuff, right? That's bread and butter. But the theists also lose a lot, and I think that the atheists end up coming out better, not just in terms of strategic moves here, but in terms of focusing on what needs to be focused on. Endless debates about what God would or wouldn't do is just pointless and silly. And so I do think that you lose cosmological fine-tuning, math, miracles. You keep moral, you keep the problem or the argument from religious experience, and you keep the ontological argument. Those three stick around. I think there's problems there, and we can focus on that some other time. That's not the main focus here. Okay, so does conclusive evidence undermine the divine psychology objection? I'm not a fan of the awesome evidence term. I don't think that's a good term. I think we should be calling it something else. I'm going to use conclusive evidence here, although I think conclusive is subject dependent, and I'm going to talk about conclusive evidence for me. I don't think that crosses in the sky or Quranic verses written on atoms would be conclusive evidence at all. So I don't think that those are good examples of conclusive evidence. However, I can imagine conclusive evidence, and I'm going to call it ITBEE, impossible talking ball of energy example. So you have a ball of energy that shows up in my backyard, and it's just sitting there, and I can see it, and it's talking to me. It says that it's God, and it's just going to hang out. And then the scientists come and do tests on it, and it makes predictions about various things. Everybody can hear it. Everybody can check it out. It doesn't follow it violates the standard model of particle physics and the standard model of cosmology. whatever you want. The evidence is intersubjective, it's objective, it's multimodal, it's persistent, it's repeatable. It's not a flash of a cross in the sky, right? It just keeps going until you're convinced or whatever. Now, is that going to convince everybody? No, but it would convince me. There is nothing that you can use to force an ape like us to take the intentional stance with respect to the universe. That cannot happen. Anybody can deny whatever they want until the end of time, right? Look at a flat earther or whatever, right? So there is no way that you can compel somebody who's dead set on denying something to actually accept it. But I think that in this case, the it be example would convince me. Now, is that problem for the divine psychology objection? No, not at all. The divine psychology objection says, don't assume things about God's psychology when you're proving God's existence. Don't do that. That's silly. Same when you're trying to prove God doesn't exist, right? Don't do that. But if you're going to argue from a bunch of independent evidence that has nothing to do with the existence of God or God's psychology or whatever, to the claim that God has such and such psychology, great, that's fine. There's no problem with that. That's just a straightforward argument, right? So does the God psychology show up in the premises of your argument? Bad. Does the God psychology show up in the conclusion of your argument with a bunch of objective evidence and stuff at the beginning? Great, fine, no problem. The it be example is a perfect example. Does that undermine the objection? No, I don't think it does. So anyway, I've got 10 seconds. I think this is a logical point. I think that there's lots of other issues here. This isn't the defining issue. Confidence and the weakness objection and these other things are important too. But anyway, I think I've tried to at least say something about how to clarify the objection and the conclusive evidence worry. Thanks.
Awesome. Perfect. That was really great. So I think what we'll do now is transition into the next stage of the debate, which will be the cross-examination / hot seat section. So in this portion, each debater will have an opportunity to receive cross-examination questions from some of the other debaters. I will announce who is being cross-examined at the appropriate time. And now is the appropriate time to announce the first hot seater. So that will be Miles. And there will be 10 minutes on the clock, and people can ask him questions about his opening. So with that, 10 minutes. All right, let's go. I'm imagining Alex might.
Well, I was leaving the floor open to be polite to other people who might want to also. Miles and I have talked about this quite a lot before. Okay, I mean, so here's... Yeah, I mean, in respect to what I was saying before, when it was in terms of apples to oranges comparisons, do you think that there is always going to be an orange available for me to compare to your orange when we're looking at evidence in this case? Or do you think that there'll be, presumably you're not going to say that there's never, there's some evidence such that there's no naturalistic hypothesis that could explain it? Presumably equally well, right?
Right. So in terms of thinking of it in terms of Bayes' theorem, there will always be a hypothesis consistent with naturalism or a version of naturalism that has an equal likelihood of that evidence given theism for any possible line of evidence, I think is right. Unless it's literally a contradictory of naturalism. The proposition is that there is a God. Well, that you can't find a specific version of naturalism to yield a positive likelihood for that.
Okay, so then given that, how does the argument work then? Why is it not a draw? I mean, are you going to appeal to something about the hypotheses in terms of their simplicity or their intrinsic features or something which disrupts the symmetry there?
Well, what you're isolating is why in rational inquiry we can't pay attention only to the likelihoods. We have to factor in the prior probabilities. I mean, this is just a point that's applicable to any investigation, empirical, metaphysical, historical. you have to factor in the prior probabilities. And so, you could give this same point about there's a specific version of, the relevant scientific theory that is consistent with the evidence. And so there could never be an empirical observation which could adjudicate between Newtonian physics and modifications to it and general relativity. But obviously in the history of science, we had observations which were decisive evidence against Newtonian physics and therefore for general relativity. So I guess I just want to know why this has to be some sort of special problem for theism and naturalism. Because again, this problem of, well, you can tack on claims, specifications to any hypothesis in any domain of inquiry in order to bump up the likelihood. But I think one of the reasons that that doesn't work is that typically by tacking on more independent claims for which we don't have independent evidence, you lower the prior probability or the probability of the hypothesis itself to a negligible degree. So yes, I think that in general will be how we can proceed is by factoring in prior probabilities in addition to likelihoods.
So when it comes to, I don't want to fixate on aliens
Sure.
in particular. I'm not an aliens. I'm not an ancient aliens guy who's, the answer is aliens every time anyone says anything. Yeah. Let's go there for a moment. I mean,
Sure.
I don't feel like I'm the flat earther who's saying, oh, what you believe NASA photos, do you? That guy who seems like irrational when confronted with some evidence. He's just blatantly making an ad hoc auxiliary hypothesis that there's a conspiracy or something.
Mm-hmm.
There might be aliens, right? Why do I think that? Because the universe is super old and super big, and it seems for our level of scientific knowledge that there could be lots of opportunities for that to have taken place. And if they had done, and they were a million years more advanced in us in scientific development, they could do stuff where, easily they could do anything that you're saying is awesome scientific evidence. Is that ad hoc and am I bolting anything on to my... I don't think so. I mean, I think if something very super strange happened, like I looked out the window and saw the planets aligning and writing out the first line of the Gospel of John or whatever you want to say, I would say, well, something crazy is happening. I just think that would just lead me to pick one of the crazier versions of naturalism. And I'm just not sure why that seems so, ad hoc and like I must be doing something wrong if I do that.
But would it always make you do that? I think that's what the problem is. I'm perfectly fine with there being certain situations where, I'm sorry, what?
Sorry, I was agreeing with you. I think that's exactly the right question.
Okay. Oh shoot, what was I saying? I was saying that there are obviously going to be certain cases where the right inference is to aliens. It's just that what I'm charging is that the stalking horse objection, unless you can say more or point to a disanalogy or a lack of parallel, something that breaks the symmetry, seems to imply that there's just no possible evidence ever that could break the symmetry between naturalism and theism. And that's what's so objectionable. I mean, do you think that there's no empirical evidence which could ever make you as a naturalist go, okay, appeal to aliens, that's not the reasonable thing here. This does seem to be some evidence, just even some, for God over naturalism.
I mean, as we're cross-examining you, I'll treat that as a hypothetical question and not and not answer it.
Sure.
But Nathan, Kevin...
Yeah, so I wanted to ask a question. So first of all, I really liked your presentation, so I want to thank you for that. When you were giving your presentation, you said something like this. You said, if you believe in the awesome theistic objection fails, the awesome theistic evidence objection fails, then you are committed to believing that no possible evidence could evidence theism. Now, do you think that a priori evidence is evidence for a proposition?
So I think you're quite right to correct the form. What I mean to say is, if objection X works in the case of fine-tuning et al., it would also imply that there's no possible empirical evidence or a posteriori.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm
totally
with you
fine.
there. I'm with
totally
you
fine.
there.
Okay, totally fine. That was just a clarificatory question.
Yeah.
So that I have other things, but with that, maybe I want to go to Kevin because I'm mindful of time. If Kevin has any questions.
Yeah, good. So yeah, thanks for the a lot. I mean, making the divine psychology issue, something that a lot of folks are talking about, and for making this something that's where that identifying where the action is, and I think this is really right. Um, the the big issue that I would take would be uh, the formulation of the divine psychology objection, like what actually is the objection,
Sure.
and the really, obviously the most charitable thing for you to do would be to formulate the objection in the weakest way that's still sufficient to do the job, right? I mean, if it's too strong, then you're just, it's a sort of attacking a straw man type
Sure.
concern, right? So then the question is, the way I laid it out, which was, don't make assumptions about God's, what it would do or want or whatever, in order to prove, God's existence or any of the like omniscience, omnipotence, or whatever, good, omnibenevolence or whatever. But it's perfectly fine to conclude from, evidence that God has such and such psychological features. So I was just wondering whether that distinction and that different formulation, your formulation and that formulation, I wondered what you thought about the relative logical strengths of them.
Right. So I think the point is fair that there might be weaker formulations of the divine psychology objection, and maybe even the way I formulate it in the paper is not fair to the way it really originally was. It seemed to me that it was, that there were enough authors who were making these strong claims, and that's what I was adjudicating. I would need to hear more about what this modified or more modest formulation of the objection is getting at. This will be something I bring up if I can in my cross-examination with you, or your cross-examination, is how we get to a conclusion about God's preferences if we don't already start out with some concrete likelihoods.
Yeah.
So, for example, with your the ball of energy, the impossible ball of energy, it seems to me that can only be evidence for certain proclivities on God's part if we think that ball of energy has a higher likelihood given theism than given naturalism. That just is to say, it's only evidence for theism if we already can say that ball of energy, God would be more likely to create that ball of energy than that ball of energy would be to exist under naturalism. So there's already a claim about God's psychology that's baked into the evidential argument for theism. So I guess I just don't know how you avoid that. Avoid appealing to God's psychology in an argument for theism, even in your case that you give.
Yeah, good. There's got to be a difference between claims about probabilities about what would happen and claims about God's psychological states. And probabilities about what would happen, I think, can be fine. That I don't see that that's violating, off the right off the or automatically violating the sort of no divine psychology stipulation. So yeah, I think that's where I would kind of push back on this is, the relationship between, claims about probabilities, what God would do under certain circumstances, a conditional probability claim versus attributing God mental states that
Sure.
promote it. Anyway, that's where I would go.
Could I come in just to add a point to what I think Kevin is saying? I think what Kevin is saying, for some clarificatory purposes, is really that the it-be example would be confirmatory of the low probability premise, which is to say that this is very unlikely given naturalism, but it's not confirmatory of the high probability premise, which is that if God exists, then this would likely happen. And so we need to parse those things out. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Maybe Kevin can say that, but I don't know. I think that's what you're getting at.
Part of it is just an other minds type thing. I mean, I think like having testimony from a God where it talks to you or he talks to you, and you're processing, communication. That's a different sort of structure. It brings in all the other minds type issues, and I think it also rises to a level of evidence that you don't get from the sort of crosses in the sky and other sorts of things. So, if I was really going to be convinced, I think I would need a God talking to me and like saying, here's what happened when you were 4, and you know what I mean? Like, no one else saw it, but I did, and like, here's what you're gonna say tomorrow. The bird's gonna fly, you know, all this, and then the scientists know that it's all incompatible with you know, standard models, whatever. I mean, you know, I think
Yeah.
that's a different class. Not just that's different. You can't just capture that with straightforward probability considerations or conditional probabilities, because it brings in a new kind of consideration, which is the sort of testimony consideration.
Yeah. What is the time, Nathan? Am I
Yeah, so the time we got 2 minutes. We got one more question for Travis.
okay? Well, can I make
to mention, like,
can I make a
go ahead.
comment just because if I'm in the hot seat? Yeah. So we'll talk more about this in your cross exam. But I would just say that, you know, if we're taking a probability conception of evidence, which is the only one that makes sense to me, then if the infinite ball of energy, which contradicts our physics, is supposed to be evidence for theism over naturalism, the only way that cashes out is to say that the probability or the likelihood of this ball of energy given theism is higher than the likelihood given naturalism, which just is to make a claim about what God would likely do in some circumstance, that the likelihood that God would create this thing is higher than that it would happen given naturalism. And so if your psychology objection is weak enough to permit that inference, then it seems to me it's too weak to undermine the fine-tuning argument, for example. So that would be where I'd want to press.
That's so helpful. Thank you.
Perfect. We'll go to Travis for the last question.
Yeah, Miles, I just wanted to ask quickly about kind of the current state of the fine-tuning argument literature, because I haven't kept up on this as well as I should have recently. I think the last thing I read on this was Waller's book with Routledge, and I don't remember the stalking horse issue coming up in that book. So I'm wondering, like, how much this argument's being pressed in the literature, or who's pressing this as an objection to fine-tuning. And the reason why I'm asking this is that it like, to me, like, I'm wondering if this indicates something about the current state of that literature, that is, at least at first glance to me, as an objection against the fine-tuning argument, this seems like a bit of a desperate move, right? I mean, the older ways of objecting to fine-tuning have been things like putting forward alternative hypotheses to explain the appearance of fine-tuning, or so the multiverse, or in different accounts of the laws of nature, or something like this. Whereas, like, if this is coming up a lot in the current literature, I wonder if that indicates that these other approaches are viewed as having failed, or if, anyway, I just want to ask, so the question is basically like, who is raising this? Is this
I would
a
say my
commonly
brief answer
discussed
is it
issue
doesn't
now
seem
in
to
the
have
literature on this?
percolated into the scholarly literature yet, but it is pretty big on the internet and on YouTube. Troy Dana and I have a paper under review right now where we took Alex Malpass's, he's the original formulator of the stalking horse objection. We took it, and because Troy Dana, who's a brilliant guy, independent scholar, he took it very seriously, and he forced me to take it very seriously, and we provided like a formalization of the stalking horse objection. So if it gets published, that'll be a nice contribution to making it, bringing it to scholarly attention. Because I think the objection fails, but I think that to get there, you learn a lot of interesting things along the way about probability. And Troy made me aware that it's not an immediate failure. There is a prima facie plausible formulation of it. So that's where it's at.
One point for Travis is Plantinga gives us objection in his 2011 book. Where the conflict really lies, it's on page 221. So yeah. And that's time. So now we're going to go to the next person in the hot seat, who is, I'm not sure. Maybe we can put Alex in the hot seat next, because I think that would be fair.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your opening statement. So you distinguish kind of bare theism on the one hand, and there's bare naturalism, and then within each of those there's specific versions. So like omnitheism would be a specific version of bare theism, but then there would be a kind of like counterpart apple on the naturalist side, which maybe makes all the same predictions. And it sounds like you want to kind of concede that maybe omnitheism does a reasonably good job predicting things like fine tuning maybe, but it's such a small sliver of the bare theism part of prior probability space that it doesn't end up with a very high posterior, right? So I wanted to hear your thoughts on kind of standard arguments that you see in the literature from kind of Swinburne and others that actually omnitheism should get a relatively sizable share of the bare theism part of probability space on account of its kind of simplicity and non-arbitrariness and other theoretical virtues like that. And so, I mean, the way I kind of like to think about this is like, okay, so, we've got these kind of simple posits like, that are very non-arbitrary, like what's the scope of God's awareness? You've got some kind of like mind-like thing at the foundation of reality. There's going to be a question about like the scope of its awareness. Seems like a distinctly simple, non-arbitrary answer to like what aspects of reality is the foundational mind aware of is all aspects. It's going to be like omniscient. All aspects of reality are kind of present to its consciousness. A distinctly simple, non-arbitrary answer to like what's the scope of its power will be, well, it can do anything or anything logically possible or something along those lines. And so you get something like omnipotence. And then you ask about like, okay, what are the motivations of this being? I mean, conceivably, a foundational mind could like aim at or desire, have a teleological orientation towards anything. It could care about paper clips. It could care about like a long laundry list of things like cheese and tungsten and quasars. But it seems to me that like caring about like goodness, qua goodness, or like just wanting to bring about good things is the kind of like simplest and least arbitrary hypothesis you could possibly put forward about the aims of the foundational mind. And I mean, Swinburne says some things that I find pretty compelling here. So, he's like, well, given a kind of like motivational internalism, if you know what's good and you know what you ought to do and you know the reasons there are for doing it, then that's going to imply at least some motivation to act accordingly. That's a not terribly implausible claim a priori. That by itself wouldn't imply that like the good is the only thing you care about. But the simplest and least arbitrary hypothesis about the motives of the foundational mind would be that it has only the motivations that are implied by its omniscience. And therefore, like a foundational mind that like cares about the good and only the good seems like a distinctly simple, non-arbitrary hypothesis about the goals or aims or teleological orientation of the foundational mind. So to me, that makes kind of omnitheism kind of in the running as like a distinctly probable specific version of bare theism. I wonder what you think about that general line of thought.
I mean, I don't think I have anything particularly brilliant to say about this, to be honest. I mean, it just does seem to me that like God could want anything, and I'm not really persuaded. I mean, maybe I just don't understand the argument very well, but I don't understand why should I think that God would be more inclined to desire the good as opposed to the aesthetically interesting, for instance? And why not that instead? And maybe his interpretation of what's aesthetically interesting involves things that are not good in the normal sense, right? I'm just not really clear why. To me, the Swinburne's perspective seems like he's getting to a conclusion that is where he started, basically, and it's sort of no surprise that Swinburne thinks the traditional kind of conservative perspective that he has is also reflected in the divine mind. I mean, it seems very anthropocentric to me, to be honest. I think if we didn't have, if you weren't steeped in Christian values or whatever, if we try and abstract ourselves out of our historical contexts and think with an open mind about it, I think those arguments do seem a lot weaker. I mean, this is not a particularly focused type of response. I just think that, like, when I'm trying to think clearly about it, God could want anything. It's just a blank slate, and that just means that the two halves of the probability space are quite symmetrical to one another. And I'm just not. I don't know. I don't get the feeling that there's a particularly big space that's occupied by the omni-God, and that perhaps the right way to think about it is there's an infinite variety of non-omni-gods, and the omni-God is just one tiny little infinitesimal slither of the possible theism space. And then what's wrong with that view? That kind of feels plausible to me. So yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit, perhaps, but
I wonder what you think about that motivational internalist premise, that if you know that you ought to do something or that it's good to do something, that entails at least some degree of motivation to do that thing. Or, a variant of that would be that makes it not terribly unlikely that you would have at least that an agent that you otherwise know nothing about would have at least some degree of motivation to do that thing. Because if you accept that, then it looks like, okay, from there, the simplest hypothesis is that it has, and we assume that the being is omniscient. Then you're going to get the simplest hypothesis about the being's motivations will be just that it has this kind of general orientation towards the good.
Yeah, I guess and maybe I just seem like one of these kind of basic, or as it might be, desperate responses here. But I guess when I'm thinking about what God, if we're pondering such an abstract thing about what God's motivations might be, now I'm inclined to wonder about whether or not my grasp of the good is something that I should be like relying on in order to be a compass to orient myself around what God's. So let's say maybe God is inclined towards the good, and maybe that does all follow. But now I guess I'm wondering whether or not I should be relying on what my grasp, my human, fallible, kind of flawed grasp of what the good is, to be a good guide to telling me what God would want to do. Right? Maybe God's understanding of what the good is perfectly great, but mine's not. So that means that He is acting towards the good. By making the universe filled with suffering or whatever. Maybe it's just, it doesn't help me, even if we say that God is inclined towards the good, to know what God would do then. Maybe that's also still the case. Am I desperately clutching at any kind of flotsam to hold on to? I don't know, possibly. But I'm just trying to sort of call it as I see it. I guess I just don't, I don't know. And maybe there's just one other thing, which is like, it's like when we're trying to evaluate what the probability space is like, I then have this kind of epistemic worry that like maybe I don't know maybe I'm getting it wrong or something. So it's like on the one hand, I'm trying to formalize where the probabilities lie, and then on the other hand, like above that is I could be landing these numbers in different ways, of course. So like there's a kind of meta probability space on top of the one, like different ways that I could imagine the probability space. And even on that level, I'm sort of unsure about it. So yeah, I'm kind of find this whole thing very confusing, to be honest.
So Alex, I want to ask you about some potential problems for atheistic axiarchism, which is the view that there's no God, but reality is fundamentally biased toward goodness, that things exist because it's good for them to exist. I think there are two difficulties with this view. One is, although I can see why an agent would be disposed to do what's good, it's hard for me to understand why an impersonal reality would be disposed to bring about what's good. It seems like goodness is something to which agents respond. And so there's an asymmetry between atheistic axiarchism and theism there. Here's another problem, which I think is the more serious one. If axiarchism says that things exist because it's good for them to exist, then it stands to reason that if axiarchism were true, the best thing would exist. And God, traditionally conceived of, is a perfect being. He's the best possible thing. And so it seems like maybe there's not a strict entailment, right? But it does seem like the probability of theism given axiarchism is very high, which means the probability of atheism given axiarchism is very low. So there's going to be sort of an internal tension to the hypothesis. I think these might like drive the prior probabilities down low enough that theism comes out way ahead. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, so to take your second argument, right? I presumably you're not going to be particularly sympathetic to the view that, like, imagine the best possible thing existed and he had all power, therefore the best possible universe would exist, right? I mean, you're going to say, well, no, hold on, there'll be some like theodicy that explains why it's not the best possible universe. There's all sorts of reasons that God might have for letting, people suffer and blah, blah, blah. okay, great. I mean, if you're going to do something like that, couldn't a sufficiently imaginative axiarchist come up with some equivalent of theodicy to say, well, yeah, okay, and universe is inclining towards the good, but it's not perfectly successful because blah 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 theodicy reasons. I mean, it doesn't seem like this is quite symmetrical, is it not?
Well, so I'm not sure I'm quite following the objection, but so you let me know if I'm getting this wrong. For one thing, I actually think axiarchism just predicts the existence of anything that's on the whole good. If it's good, it exists. That's the simplest formulation of axiarchism. So I actually think that given axiarchism, there might be universes that are less than optimal simply because they're on the whole good. And I think we could say something similar about theism. This is sort of the multiverse theodicy. We don't have to get into that, but so I actually do think there's symmetry there. Another thing, though, is if we're going to reformulate axiarchism so that it says things exist because they're sort of good, or good things exist to this extent and no further, then I think the prior probability goes down again because we've sort of inserted an arbitrary limitation into the causal efficacy of goodness. That would be analogous, right, to positing the existence of a God with limited power rather than a God with unlimited power, right? And so,
well,
go ahead.
Maybe. I mean, and I don't know why an axiarchist couldn't posit that, the gravitational pull of the good in the axiarchal world is less than supremely attractive, right? I mean, I don't know why that. There's an axiarchal theodicy for you right there. It's just like gravitational effect of the good is like not that strong or something, and that's why although things tend towards the good, they don't just like immediately slam right into the perfect. I just think that I kind of just think if the perfect being theist has a thought of room in his worldview or whatever to allow for there to be hiddenness and evil and imperfect creation, then surely there's some similar kind of imaginative resources on the part of an axiarchist they could come up with. If you gave me enough time and I sat and thought about it for long enough, and I'm not even an axiarchist, so I don't know why I'm defending the view really, but let's play the game anyway. I just feel like I could, as a sort of creative writing exercise, come up with some mirror image version of theodicies that applied to like Leslie's view, right? I just think it's strange if you were thinking, well, a perfect being theist can get out of these problems, but an axiarchist couldn't. That just strikes me as very implausible. I think that sometimes with these things, it kind of just turns into sort of lack of imagination. It just feels like, you just can't imagine how a naturalist would respond. And to me, it just feels like it's kind of trivial. A naturalist could easily cook up some fairy tale story if that's what we're doing. And that strikes me as the sorts of things that some theodicies, at the very least, sound like to me.
Okay, so I think
creative ways of thinking about it.
Yeah. Oh, maybe one last thing. I think I understand better what's going on now. The issue is, if the theist can come up with an explanation for why there's evil and hiddenness, then the axiarchist should be able to come up with an explanation for why there's no God. I think I would challenge that premise, and here's why. I think although I can sort of imagine some plausible reasons for why God might allow hiddenness and evil, I can't think of a reason for preventing a perfect being from existing. If God is the best possible thing, if he's literally perfect, if he's always going to do what he has most reason to do, if he's going to guarantee that, all the evils that occur, all the hiddenness there is justified, then it's hard for me to see, what reason could there be for preventing the existence of a being like that? And at the very least, I'll say this: most of the theodicies that theists want to give aren't going to deliver anything like that. Like the free will theodicy, for instance, the omission theodicy that Brian has defended. Even if you accept that theodicy, you're not thereby going to get a reason why it's suboptimal for a perfect being to exist. So I still think there's going to be a cost here.
Okay, was that 10 seconds?
Yeah.
I mean, probably won't get any other questions in. I mean, so let me just have the last word then, I guess. I think that I thought I took your idea to be on axiarchism. It should be that a perfect being gets produced because you're tending towards the good in creation naturalistically. Well, how come then it's not theism, right? I'd have to have some reason for thinking how come axiarchism doesn't succeed in realizing the perfect. But my response was some story like perfect being theists tell about why God doesn't make the perfect world would be something I could say. Maybe he has sufficient. Maybe it's. I don't know. Off the top of my head, an axiarchist could just say something like, the gravitational effect of the good is less than perfect. So it's trying to get there. It's doing its best, but it's stuck halfway or something. And that would be similar to a kind of limited God theodicy or something like that. And I think give me some time, and I'll probably come up with a more imaginative one. That's all. Hopefully that made sense anyway.
Thank you. That was really great. So now we'll transition to the next hot seat, which will be Brian Cutter. So now enjoy your hot seat. Get ready for a question. Paul, go ahead.
I want to follow up on the exchange between Alex and Brian. So Brian was saying that, well, you start off with some plausible hypothesis about, mental stuff is at the foundations of reality or is the ultimate reality or something like that. And then you ask me, what's the most likely way of specifying that in more detail? And omnitheism is plausible because, with being all powerful, there's no limits to the power. With omniscient, no limits. So kind of the Swinburne idea that these things are simpler than if you specify a particular degree of finite power or a particular degree of finite knowledge. And then you add in the stuff about internal motivation, motivational internalism, to say that, here's another way of doing it. Most likely thing with respect to non-rational desires is that a being would have zero of them. And so would do whatever, they have the best reason to do. And so isn't that a much simpler view? So wouldn't that dominate the probability space in a way that would make theism particularly reasonably high, or at least not too low of a starting probability, prior probability? So I think Alex could have answered in a different way than he did. Try this. Grant all that stuff to some extent. Grant most of what Swinburne stuff. I'd put it a little differently, like with omnipotence, I think it's not so much simplicity as it's coherence, right? So if you have certain power, then you're likely to have other power just by kind of induction. I can do this, I can do this, I can do that, I can probably do something else. So there's a kind of, anytime you posit uniformity, you get that internal inductive support from the different parts of your hypothesis. Similarly for omniscience, and probably having, again, if you have some desires, then why don't you have other ones? So it's probably more probable just say you have no desires. But the problem with that type of reasoning, and including the way Swinburne does it, is that that might show that omnipotence is more likely than any other specific degree of power. The issue isn't that. The issue is whether, how omnipotence compares to all the different alternative levels of power. And so that's bringing into play Swinburne's criterion of modesty. The more modest something is, the higher its intrinsic probability. Right? The more ways it has of being true, the more likely it is to be true. So there's lots of ways to fail to be omnipotent. So even though the omnipotence is more likely than any other specific degree of finite power, it's going to be way less likely than the whole disjunction of all the ways you could have finite power. And similarly, and similarly for omniscience, similarly for, there's all kinds of ways you could have non-rational desires that then would mess up your inference to the, God, we'd expect good things to come from God. So Swinburne has a response to that. He says, he says, I mean, he just basically he just says, well, I'm just going to give way more weight to simplicity than to modesty. And he tries to defend that by appealing to what scientists have done in the past. And it's true, scientists often do give way more weight to simplicity than to modesty. But all those if you look at the history of scientific theories, they always end up being wrong, because it always turns out, no, there is some other alternative that later is proven to be true. So that, the pessimistic induction stuff. So you really shouldn't appeal to scientists here, because, I mean, if you appeal to science, the history of science in that way, that would count against Swinburne. So I was wondering if, what you would say about that.
Yeah,
Brian.
good. So omnitheism maybe scores higher on simplicity, but it's very immodest. And so, like, does it do better than the disjunction of all these less simple, like, finite power and finite knowledge hypotheses? Good. So here's an example I like that I think I initially got this from Dustin Crummett, and I think maybe a similar example comes up in some of Callum Miller's work. I don't know who's originally responsible for it, but where you have a kind of similar trade-off at play, and where I think, like, simplicity wins out, simplicity outweighs modesty. So the example is, like, consider the hypothesis that certain certain, like, fundamental laws or physical equations hold everywhere throughout the universe, versus the hypothesis that they hold everywhere except for some cubic meter region, where for no reason at all those equations break down and matter follows a completely different set of rules. Now, understand that second hypothesis as non-specific with respect to where the anomalous region is, and so it's very it's very modest in that there's infinitely many ways for it to be true, corresponding to each of the infinitely many candidate locations of the anomalous region. So notice this. The two theories predict our evidence about exactly equally well, because if there is some anomalous region somewhere, it's, like, astronomically unlikely that we would have encountered it, because it could be, like, anywhere in the universe. So the two theories predict our evidence equally well, and yet it seems a posteriori that we should be much more confident in the uniformity hypothesis, that these same equations hold everywhere, versus the anomalous hypothesis that they hold everywhere except for some or other cubic meter sized anomalous region. So that means that the prior probability, so, like, assuming the uniformity hypothesis is coming out ahead a posteriori, given that they predict our evidence equally well, it just follows by the Bayesian math that the uniformity hypothesis must have been ahead a priori in the ultimate priors, even though it's way, way less modest than the anomalous patch one. Because the anomalous patch one, there's infinitely many ways for it to be true. The uniformity hypothesis, there's only one way for it to be true. These equations need to hold absolutely everywhere without exception. And yet I think we would all agree that the uniformity hypothesis is more plausible a posteriori. The only way to get that is for its priors to be higher. And so that's just a case where simplicity wins out over considerations of modesty. It seems to me that the case of theism versus the disjunction of all the limited theisms is going to be omnitheism versus the disjunction of all the limited theisms will be pretty analogous. I'll add one further point here, which is, in order to get a limited theist hypothesis that predicts our evidence just as well as theism, I don't think it's going to be enough to just say there's some limited being, or there's some being with a high but limited degree of power, knowledge, and goodness. You're probably going to need a really weird, arbitrary, gerrymandered looking package of abilities and inabilities, or knowledge and lack of knowledge. So an example is Philip Goff. He basically posits a limited God. So he wants some kind of designer to account for fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony and stuff like this, but he wants a limited God to avoid the problem of evil. But notice here that he's not just positing a being with a high but finite degree of power, goodness, and knowledge. He needs a very specific, arbitrary-looking package of abilities and inabilities. So the designer needs to be powerful enough to like create a whole universe, fine-tune the constants, inject consciousness in harmonious ways, but also somehow lack the power to prevent tree branches from falling on people's heads. And so it's like a very specific, arbitrary-looking package of abilities and inabilities. And I think that that's going to sink the prior lower than just like, high but finite degree of power.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I take your second point. I think it's a good one. Although I think there are ways of specifying that are not real arbitrary. But I don't want to get into that. It's too long thing. I just want to respond to the first point that you made briefly. It's kind of interesting how in like contemporary physical cosmology, we're now starting. There's a lot of theories out there that involve saying that there, multiple universes are really they are just other regions of space where the laws that we're familiar with don't hold. Or if you talk about, when we move into high energies, we don't think the laws that, that we're used to apply everywhere or in all conditions, right? They don't apply once you get to a certain high energy level. So it's kind of like maybe, it sounds really plausible. So yeah, they should apply everywhere at any time. But on the other hand, that immodesty may bite you in the butt in the end.
All right, perfect. We have a little bit of time remaining. If anyone has any questions for Brian,
About 3 minutes.
About 3 minutes.
If I can ask one question, it's just an opportunity to get your view on this, I suppose, rather than it being like particularly well developed. But sometimes with this awesome theistic evidence stuff, it comes across to me as a bit of like a reductio, where you're saying something like, well, if this theory says this isn't awesome theistic evidence, then it's wrong because it obviously is evidence for God, right? And anyone who thinks that this isn't evidence for God is like the person who's committing to a contradiction or something, and you have to recoil. The mind must recoil from such an absurd proposition. But I kind of just wonder whether maybe this is, there are theist traditions, Christian theists as well, who have held that there is no evidence for God one way or the other. I guess I'm thinking Kierkegaard. And pretending to understand Kierkegaard that well, but there are people who say that, and isn't this reductio another way of looking at it? It's kind of presumption of evidentialism or something, whatever the opposite of fideism is. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think you're right that there are Christian thinkers who have denied that there's evidence for God, or at least that observations of the natural world could constitute evidence for God. I'm not one of those theists. I'm a theist, but I think that there not only could be, but is significant evidence for theism based on observations we've made from the natural of the natural world. I don't really think of the awesome theistic evidence reply quite along the lines you were suggesting. So I wouldn't say, look, fine tuning is just completely awesome, undeniable evidence, and if you don't see that, if you don't agree, that's just as crazy as saying that the messages in the stars wouldn't be evidence for God. That's not my view, and that's not what I take myself to be arguing here. I see the awesome theistic evidence reply as more just like showing that there must be something wrong with certain objections that are commonly raised to arguments like the fine-tuning argument and other design arguments, not saying that fine-tuning is itself evidentially comparable to messages in the sky and things like that. So with respect to fine-tuning, I guess I think it's some evidence. I think it's very impressive evidence against single universe naturalism. I think maybe there's some kind of multiverse theory that could account for it. There's well-known difficulties for those multiverse theories, but I can't claim to have ruled out all all reasonably plausible versions of them. So yeah, I wouldn't say that the fine-tuning evidence is evidentially comparable to the awesome theistic evidence that we've been discussing.
Okay, perfect. So that is time for that hot seat. We will now transition to my hot seat, which is Miles's favorite time. So we'll now he's like, you're kidding me. Anyway, so yeah, here we go. Oh wow, yeah, all the Purdue people. Okay, no, and Miles. Okay, Noah, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I've got a question about your argument. The argument was conditional, or was an argument for a conditional claim that if hiddenness doesn't confirm atheism, then awesome theistic evidence wouldn't confirm theism. And I wonder, what's the problem with just granting that hiddenness confirms atheism to some degree? Because as Paul pointed out earlier, this isn't exactly the point that Paul made earlier, actually. But I think we can consistently say that hiddenness is some confirmation of atheism, perhaps weak confirmation of atheism, and still maintain that awesome theistic evidence would be extremely powerful confirmation for theism. We could just be theists and just take the evidential hit from hiddenness, say the hit's not too bad, the fine-tuning argument vastly outweighs it. What's sort of the problem with taking that approach?
I was just writing notes. Apologies.
No worries.
Yeah. So I think the question is a good one. Here's what I think the issue is. The issue is that if you abandon some of the divine psychology stuff that enables you to cast away the problem of divine hiddenness, when the divine hiddenness problem comes back, it's going to be a lot stronger. And so whatever your reply to that version of the divine hiddenness argument is going to be might be more suspect, because essentially what's happening in this little duel is that you're wearing some armor, but it turns out that you're allergic to the armor. And then so you take the armor out and now you have to do the duel. And it turns out that you're going to be more vulnerable to the blows of your opponent. And I think that that's sort of what's happening in this situation. Yeah, that's what I think about this, is you're just going to make yourself more vulnerable. I mean, this isn't a knockdown blow. It's not an argument that's going to make your head explode because it's so powerful. But I think certainly it raises the theoretical costs of making such a move.
I'm thinking that what the theist should do is not run the divine psychology objection against the hiddenness argument. They should run other kinds of responses, like, for example, the response that if God's presence were too obvious, then belief in theism would be coercive, and God doesn't want to coerce us into believing that he exists. Now, we could have a debate about the merits of that response, but I suppose I'm just asking, what's the problem with granting, the divine psychology objection doesn't resolve hiddenness, especially given that what we're trying to argue is that alternative theistic evidence undermines some objections, some serious objections to major theistic arguments. And it sounds like what you're saying is, well, it would also undermine some objections to some atheistic arguments. And I suppose I'm thinking, sure, it seems right. Why can't we just grant that?
Sure, good. So I really, first of all, as a side note, I don't think that the hiddenness and the evil arguments work. So I'm very influenced by Kevin here, my erstwhile undergrad advisor. I'm playing in the theistic sandbox right now. I'm merely talking to the person who thinks that hiddenness is a problem. Okay, so I myself don't defend hiddenness. What I want to just tack onto with respect to your question is this. You said, shouldn't we just run these alternative responses to divine hiddenness, according to which, God wouldn't want to make his existence so obvious. Why? Because that wouldn't foster filial relationships, right? As I take it as what you're saying. But notice then that what I'm going to do is I'm going to be like, well, look, because you just employed divine psychology, I'm going to say that there's an undercutting defeater for that because you don't have good reasons to believe that stuff. So I could either run that, or I could then say, well, we have a problem of evil, and then things might wash out. So there are two problems that I think that might emerge. So here's the first. The first is, I just don't see any good reason to believe the types of divine psychological assumptions that you're importing in to make that reply to the divine hiddenness stuff. So that's the first point. The second point is, it seems like there's not a really good principled way to say, like, okay, well, we have awesome theistic evidence on one side, and then we have hiddenness on the other side, and exactly like where do things wash out, or fine-tuning on the one side, and then we have evil and hiddenness on one side. Where do things wash out? It's difficult to say once we're allowed to play divine psychology. As Kevin said one time, I think in his debate with Craig, it's like playing the imaginary tea party with the toddler, and we all know who wins that game, right? So it's like the person making up the rules. And I don't know if this is a successful strategy. So yeah, I think that's what I would say.
I think maybe I'm losing the thread a little bit. So the resolution we're debating is that the awesome theistic evidence response undermines some serious objections to theistic arguments. And it seems to me that the argument you gave in your speech doesn't establish that. If anything, it just establishes that awesome theistic evidence also undermines some responses to some atheological arguments. And so maybe it was a mistake for me to even talk about how the theist can deal with hiddenness in the first place. That might actually have been off topic. But I guess I'm just wondering, how is the argument that you gave in your opening speech supposed to show that the awesome theistic evidence response doesn't work?
Okay, good. So I think that in a way, it's a very minimal argument, right? So I guess all I'm really trying to say is that, look, you can run this argument, but the cost of running the argument might be severe, or the theists themselves might have reasons to think that they shouldn't believe some of the key assumptions in the awesome theistic evidence objection. So it's really a dialectical move that is the one that I'm making. I mean, I have other arguments that I could have marshaled in response to why I think that the awesome theistic evidence objection falls short. So some of those would have relied on vacuism, but I think that those are way too powerful for purpose. So really all I want to say is this, is that there are a certain band of theists for whom the awesome theistic evidence objection shouldn't have traction. And as it turns out, that's a lot of them, right? So if you think that this mainline reply to the awesome theistic evidence objection, to divine hiddenness is plausible, then you just shouldn't think that the awesome theistic evidence would in fact be evidence for theism. And that just takes out a huge chunk of theists. Does it show for sure that awesome theistic evidence doesn't work? No, it doesn't. It just shows that certain theists can't run this argument. And I know that's like very minimalistic and it's kind of unsatisfying and, for whatever reasons, but I wanted to have a very low burden. And my low burden is, here's a group of theists and they can't run this argument. And so, yeah, but I could give the vacuous stuff, but I've been nailed to the cross for doing that. So I tried to go with something a little bit more modest. I think the next person in the queue was Paul.
No, I already asked raised the Purdue objection, so I'm good.
It's trademarked. All right, so we'll go with Miles.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for this argument. I share Noah's suspicions here that it's just not directly relevant or pertinent to the resolution under debate. I mean, unless you're willing to argue for that second premise of this argument, that one, if theists should not think that hiddenness isn't confirming evidence for atheism, then theists should not think that AT is confirming evidence for theism. Two, theists shouldn't think that hiddenness is confirming evidence for theism. I mean, unless you're willing to give an argument for that, then your point is just that theists who give the ATE response now face the problem of answering the problem of hiddenness and the problem of evil and so on and so forth. And that's perfectly fine. Like I, for instance, accept that. I accept that hiddenness is some evidence against God's existence. But accepting that doesn't do anything to undermine the resolution, which is very modest and circumspect. So I guess I was wondering, I mean, I think you're caught in a tension here between wanting to just, show this implication, but then you kind of seem to incline to say that this second premise is actually true, which then I think would make it directly relevant to the resolution. So, I mean, do you think that second premise is true? And like, if so, why?
Yeah. So sure. So yeah, I do think that the second premise is true, and I could provide some reasons for thinking that it's true. So the first is to say, so to recall, what is the second premise, right? So the second premise is that the theists, shouldn't think, hang on, let me draw up my brief. So the second premise, oh, this is not it. Okay, one second. Yeah, so the second premise of my argument is theists don't think that hiddenness is confirming evidence for atheism over theism. And yeah, so I think that that's pretty plausible. People like Moser think that because they think that God, if God exists, then he's going to be elusive, right? He's going to bob and weave. He's going to sort of dip in and out because that's the kind of being that he is. And you also see this with Moreland and Craig, right? They say that, well, God isn't in the business of actually engaging in these fantastical displays of his existence. Now, if that's the case, if God is the type of being who wouldn't engage in fantastical displays of his existence, then if we saw the fantastical displays of his existence, we should say, like, that's probably not God because he's just not that kind of guy, at least according to what the theists have written. Here's an analogy. So, I mean, like, imagine that, and so this comes from Perry Hendricks. So imagine your parents know that you're incredibly anxious all the time. They don't like, bothering you, they inducing anxiety in you, and you're going to a graduation, right? And so you're accepting your diploma, and then someone comes up to you and they say something like, or you hear your father's voice in the distance. The thought is that you go like, well, knowing what I know about my dad, I know that he wouldn't do things like that. So because of things that you know about the person, you think that, well, that's probably not, my dad saying my name. It could be someone else who has a similar timbre with respect to their voice. The thought is that theists make this similar move, which is to say, if I saw the sign, I would have some reason to think that, well, really that wouldn't be God because I know certain things about him that would exclude such flashy displays of his existence. And there are a lot of theists who make that move. And what I want to say is that for the theists who do make that move, they shouldn't think that, for instance, the awesome evidence would be confirmatory of theism. So yeah, that would be the defense of that premise. Oh, wow. Everyone loves my arguments, or they hate them, hence the questions.
Can I just follow up briefly on that point?
Yeah, always, so, of course. Here we are.
Suppose I'm a theist who thinks that just like reflection on the nature of God leads me to think that almost certainly God would be elusive if he exists. So I'm not at all surprised by the hiddenness of God. It seems to me that that's compatible with and would naturally go along with the claim that nonetheless, God's lack of obviousness or hiddenness, or however you want to cash that out, is at least some evidence for atheism.
Yeah.
Because even though it was very likely that God would be elusive conditional on theism, it's even more likely that God's existence would be not obvious conditional on atheism. And so it's at least going to be a tiny bit of evidence for atheism, even though it's totally unexpected from this point of view. So just an example, suppose like, I don't know if anyone has been in my home while I've been away all day, but I know that the only person who could possibly have been in my home is my roommate, who's a slob. And when I left, the house was totally dirty. Okay, so assuming someone was in the house, would I expect it to be clean? No, because my roommate's the only guy who could have been there, and he's not the kind of guy who cleans. But nonetheless, if I come home and it's clean, that's that's evidence that my roommate was there. If I come home and it's still dirty, that's going to be at least a tiny bit of evidence for the same reason that my roommate wasn't there, even though it's not like really strong evidence because it's totally unsurprising. That's exactly what I'd expect my roommate to do. Nonetheless, it's slightly more likely that it would still be messy if my roommate wasn't there, so it's at least a tiny bit of evidence that my roommate wasn't there.
Okay, good. So I really appreciate the question. I think this gets into Kevin's weakness problem. So let's just take your point. I take it. So the first claim is, that the hiddenness evidence would be at least in like an itty bitty amount of evidence for atheism. And so what I'm interested in, and maybe I could ask like a clarificatory point, right? Is maybe we could say something like this. Oh no. Actually, no. I think you're right. Yeah. So you can maybe say that it's a little bit of evidence for atheism, but it wouldn't be confirmatory of atheism, if that makes sense. Like it wouldn't warrant belief in atheism. It wouldn't be strong enough to generate the belief that like, oh well, atheism is true. And I think that potentially is a way of replying, although I do admit that I think that your response is actually quite a good one. And what I'm interested in is like confirmatory evidence, right? These types of things, right? So things that would probably switch you into believing that the thing is true, not knowing, of course. And so if it's like a little bit of a modicum, like, yeah, it's not confirmatory of atheism, but it's just like a little bit. But perhaps I should modify exactly how I phrase my argument, or maybe I went over a little bit too quickly. But yeah, no, I take the point, and I think it's a very interesting one. So yeah, no, that was very helpful. That is as much time as I have. I'll have to, email you about that argument a little bit more. But yeah, no, that's good. Okay, so next we're going to have Paul go. Paul's going to be in the hot seat. All right, no, go ahead.
This is more of a question than an objection, but in your earlier dialogue with Brian, you were suggesting that non-uniformity does show up some places in nature. So, for instance, medium-sized dry goods near the surface of the earth obey Newton's laws for the most part, but then there are exceptions when you get away from the surface of the earth. But I want to know what you think about this thought. Uniformity is going to be more likely at the fundamental layer than at the derivative layers because non-uniformity requires explanation. And there are fewer candidate explanations for non-uniformity at the fundamental layer. So let's just apply this to the physics case. The reason that Newton's laws apply non-uniformly is because they're just special cases of Einstein's equations. So once we grasp the more fundamental facts, the ones captured by relativity theory, we can see why there's non-uniformity in the application of these regularities. But theism is a claim about fundamental reality, and the claim that God's power is limitless. Therefore, that gets a big boost because this is a claim about uniformity at the fundamental reality. If there were some limitation on God's power, given that facts about how powerful God is are fundamental, it doesn't seem like there's going to be any candidates for explaining those limitations. So I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about that potential asymmetry between the cases?
Yeah, I think I agree with the main point about at the fundamental level. It's going to be you got to give a lot of weight to the uniformity. I mean, that's why the fundamental laws of nature, whatever they are, are just the sort of things that might very well be brute facts for this very reason, right? Which is why it's so ironic that Swinburne tries to give an argument from regularity for God's existence as well. He's trying to have his cake and eat it too, right? Because if this uniformity is should be given so much weight, then he says things like that this law would hold for everything, right? That all things, all electrons have this property or something like that. That would have to be like a huge coincidence. But no, I mean, that's not right. I mean, actually, the uniformity is prima facie more probable than that electrons would vary with respect to that particular fundamental property. So you can't really, so yeah, you gotta. But having said that, so I give a lot of weight to what you're saying, and I think it shows that certain arguments for God's existence don't work. Arguments from regularity don't work at all. Nevertheless, I still say, yeah, but I mean, give it a lot of weight, but you can't give it. You can't just completely ignore the modesty as if modesty wasn't even a consideration. And so, how do you balance those two? It's really difficult, to figure out exactly how to balance those two against each other. I'll stop there.
I've got a question for you, Paul. It's not so much an objection, but I know that while you agree with the second premise of the awesome theistic evidence response, that awesome theistic evidence is possible evidence for theism, you don't agree with the first one. You don't think that if these various objections to theistic arguments like fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony succeed, that they spill over and prove too much and show that awesome theistic evidence isn't evidence for theism. And I just was curious what your reasoning was, if you wanted to comment on why you reject that first premise.
Oh, it's just that, there's other problems with some of these arguments that have nothing to do with undermining the awesome theistic evidence. So certain type, like the voice from the clouds thing, yeah, that's good. That would be really strong evidence for omnitheism. Fine, but of course, that doesn't commit anyone to the view that fine-tuning is strong evidence for theism, because fine-tuning arguments can be flawed for reasons that the argument from the voice from the clouds is not flawed. So it's that simple. Now, if you're asking me, so, okay, what are these other flaws with these other theistic arguments? Well, that, of course, would be like way too big a thing to get into in this, and would be way, way off our topic for me to get into that. But the basic response is that simple.
Well, okay, so then I guess technically you still could agree with that first premise. Like the way I understand it is the ATE response says that, one, if objection X, like the stalking horse objection, the divine psychology objection, works in the case of fine-tuning et al., it would also imply that there is no possible evidence for theism. And then you have the second premise, there is possible evidence. 3, therefore, objection X does not work in the case of these standard arguments. I think you could agree
that
with
version of the first premise. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Definitely. When you said the first premise, I was going by the argument that Nate sent me when he originally contacted me about this, which had the first premise was, if Quranic verses written on every molecule are good evidence for theism, then fine-tuning is good evidence.
Right, that would be a different, much stronger.
Yeah, that's the one I was saying was, no, well, I mean, fine-tuning argument can have other problems besides the that don't apply to the Quranic verses argument, or the voice from the clouds argument, if you want a better example.
Yeah, sure, that's fair.
So you're right. I would agree that there's certain evidence, there's certain objections to fine-tuning that prove too much in the way you were describing in your opening statement.
Okay.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering about the relationship between, what you think is the relationship between the indifference principle and that's some supernatural being would be indifferent to human ends or goals, and divine psychology.
You're not. I thought you were talking about the principle of indifference.
No.
How that compared to these other criteria for deciding starting probabilities, but you're talking about the indifference hypothesis. Okay,
yeah,
that's totally different.
Sorry, no, not nothing within probability theory. I'm just more about this.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So that assumption, this hypothesis, isn't that assuming something about the psychology of any supernatural being?
That hypothesis, which I don't use in my more recent work, but that hypothesis was just saying, it was saying something. Let's suppose that hypothesis entails that if there are any supernatural minds, then they just don't care about our pain or pleasure.
Okay, good.
So it's a negative assertion, not a positive claim about their psychology. It's just saying that whatever they care about, they don't care about this.
Okay, good. I was just trying to figure out the relationship between the two there and what might have changed in your view over that time period. So that's helpful.
Okay. Is that still a question, or did I answer it?
No,
sorry.
You answered it.
Brian.
Okay.
So kind of wanted to follow up on our earlier exchange. So you thought there are these kind of more modest design hypotheses that are effectively just disjunctions of various limited designer hypotheses. And you think maybe on account of their modesty, they come out with higher prior probability. Do you think you could formulate one thought here is like something that very like generic, like there's some limited designer. Okay, that's very modest, but it doesn't really predict much, and arguably it doesn't predict the character of our natural world as well as theism. If you make the the limited designer hypothesis a little bit more specific while still maintaining a degree of modesty, you might get more predictive power. Do you think you can, this is just a question, do you think you can formulate a relatively modest but not maximally modest limited design hypothesis that, on your view, predicts the observed character of our world as well as omnitheism?
Well, I think that Cleanthes did a pretty good job in part 11 of the dialogues of formulating such a hypothesis. So, so again, in part 10, the issues about omnitheism, and then Cleanthes' response in the first paragraph of part 11 is to say, well, I've often wondered whether this claim about God's infinite power and infinite wisdom doesn't suffer more of panegyric formal praise like eulogies at funerals than of true philosophy, and if we couldn't be if we can do justice to both religion and philosophy better if we assume that God has finite power and knowledge. He doesn't put it that way. He calls it finitely perfect. But anyways, but then he goes on, and clearly the hypothesis he has in mind is one where God's not just limited by laws of logic, but also by fundamental causal laws. And so that's a pretty, that's not very specific, and then he goes on and shows how that might make a difference for the problem of evil, because now, and although, Philo tries to come back on this, but now, certain theodicies, for example, that don't work for an all-powerful, all-knowing being could work for. Okay, I'll charge it, Katie, in a second. That's my daughter. Could work for a being that's limited by causal laws, and so and Cleanthes says that then you could think that God uses the suffering as a means to achieve some greater good down the end. That he's talking about a causal means, right? If you're omnipotent, God doesn't have to use one thing as a causal means to get something else. But if you're limited by causal laws, then that could explain why God allows the suffering. So there's one example, and then of course Cleanthes that would be an alternative hypothesis that would still explain the design in the world according to Cleanthes, right? But it would do a better job with the evil, the pain and pleasure. And I think I'm out of time. I'm going to go charge my daughter's iPad.
All right, perfect. So next we're going to do Travis in the hot seat. Travis, I guess I could ask you a question. You seemed sympathetic with the awesome theistic evidence. I'm wondering, of all the things that God finds valuable, do you think that we have good reason to know what values he would be attached to?
Yeah, although, again, part of this might depend on, I think it was, can't remember who brought up the terminology earlier of bare theism. I think it was Kevin. Some of this might depend on what the presuppositions are, right? Are we working with specifically Judeo-Christian theism? Are we working with a purely philosophical theism that sort of abstracts from any particular religious commitments? Because the tricky part there is if you're trying to go with something like a bare theism, right, abstracting from any particular religious commitments, you're then kind of left up in the air about, well, what moral commitments, what axiological commitments are you plugging in to assist in making these assessments? Whereas one of the nice things about working with a pre-existing religious theism is that you've also got some moral presuppositions explicitly built in that you can work with. So whereas if it's bare theism, well, you got to specify some facts about the theism you're conceptualizing, but then also what moral system you're working with. So none of that answers your question, I know. It's just trying to point out that it may be a more complicated question than it might look like at first. But since I'm personally operating from pretty traditional Christian theism, I mean, the assumptions I'm making about morality and the assumptions I'm making about divine motivation would all be,
Sure.
downstream
So, because we're just talking
of
about, I
that
think, natural
religious
theological
framework.
arguments, many of the natural theological arguments that are in question don't get you to Christian theism necessarily. So, fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony, cosmological argument, argument from consciousness, argument from free will, that doesn't get you to the type of Christian theism. So, just within that domain, I think that we could kind of delimit some of that stuff. Given that's the case, so then I want to ask this follow-up question, which is, if we don't know what his value attachments are, whoever the God is of natural theological arguments, then why think he would be the kind of being that would produce awesome theistic evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. So the question would be, if there's a God of some sort, do we have any reason to pose that such a God would be inclined to provide awesome theistic evidence rather than not? I guess I'd be inclined to say we could probably come up with some plausible reasons to think that he might have such
Yeah, so
motivations, but I'm not sure
if I
any of
could
those
just come
reasons
in,
would be
I mean,
especially
the onus on
strong.
the theist is not to show that God could
Um,
have reasons; it's to show that God does have reasons. I mean, because the fact that God could have a reason, I mean, we just don't have an adequate. That's not an adequate basis to make a probability assessment. I think because it might admit it of an undercutting defeater, and I realize that just flared up not only the Purdue folk but Brian Cutter as well. So I don't know if we could have like maybe that's for the open discussion portion. But yeah, so yeah, I guess so. So this is my worry then. People tend to act pursuant to value attachments. If we don't know what God's value attachments are, then it's difficult to say in what sense he's going to perform one action or another. And if we kind of just concede that we don't have a good basis for knowing what the value attachments are, it seems like a lot of the game is given away because we just don't know whether or not he would actually produce the awesome theistic evidence. Does that make sense?
yeah, and I guess I'd be inclined to say that much of the landscape here is probably going to end up looking similar to the landscape you get in hiddenness discussions, right? That if you think that a generic God would have, based on omnibenevolence or something, if you think that a generic God would be rationally motivated to seek relationship with human beings, and that seeking such relationship further presupposes making his existence known to us in a rationally indubitable way, then that might then provide God with good reason to provide us with really solid evidence. And maybe if you some further debate and discussion might demonstrate that, well, such evidence would have to look
Okay,
like
so
awesome
is
theistic
the claim
evidence
that
in
we
order to
can't
really function
exactly
effectively.
calculate a value for how likely awesome theistic evidence is on theism, but it must be more likely than the disjunction of every alternative naturalistic hypothesis?
Well, I mean, I think on any naturalistic hypothesis, you're presumably that'll rule out
Well, I
having
mean,
awesome theistic
not on the
evidence, right?
simulation hypothesis, not on the aliens
Or
hypothesis,
we
not on the teleological laws hypothesis. I mean, on all of those hypotheses, as Miles's forthcoming paper concedes, yeah, like there's an expectation. It might be a little bit weird and wonky and gnarly, but we're in a weird and gnarly territory. So, I mean, it's not exactly ruled out. So I'm wondering, I mean, I think that's the corner that you're painted into, is it not? I mean, the corner is for any naturalistic alternative, the huge disjunction, whatever that disjunction is going to be, theism has to be greater than that, even though we can't calculate a precise value.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I maybe not the best interlocutor on this because I'd be inclined to say that if the space aliens are finite physical beings like us, they would not be able to provide that kind of evidence. And I think the simulation hypothesis is metaphysically impossible.
Sure, but then at that point, why not think
so I don't
that
think that
the
could provide
naturalist
it
can just say,
either.
well, yeah, I think that the theistic hypothesis is metaphysically impossible. You know, like I'm going to say, you know, I'm going to run into some kind of incoherence argument, and then what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I mean, if you could run that move, then why can't I run the other move and just say that the awesome evidence is impossible?
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, in either case, we get dragged into very other outlying debates, right, about whether or not theism is metaphysically possible, whether or not the simulation hypothesis or like AI, genuine AI, is metaphysically possible. Yeah, so we get dragged around to other territory that's gonna look of it's gonna
Okay,
look like it's
okay.
gradually
I mean, I have
decreasing in
more. I think
intermediate
that sort of
relevance. Yeah.
completes my line of questioning. I think that you're committed to thinking, or you're committed to a kind of view where um, awesome theistic evidence is more likely on theism, even though we can't calculate a precise value of it over the huge array of naturalistic disjunctive alternatives. And I think that that might be a pretty decent theoretical cost, although Miles, I know, would disagree, and he'll probably tell me about it later over Messenger. But yeah, with that, yeah, Kevin, if you have any questions, you can tune in. I'm not sure. Maybe you do.
I was just going to say that I agreed with the if there's no divine psychology, then there's no argument from hiddenness for the atheist side. I think that's exactly right, and I think that the hiddenness argument. I think it's common in arguments on both sides to find these divine psychology assumptions, and I think that you're totally right to connect that objection to the hiddenness debate. So I thought that was all perfectly right. Obviously, you're gonna draw what a modus ponens, and I'm gonna do a modus tollens, but either way, we both agree on that conditional, and I think that's important.
Yeah, good. I'm happy to go into the next question period. If because we have a little bit of time remaining. Are you happy to move into the next hot seat? Good. Okay. Just to make sure that we keep things balanced, where we go one side, the other side, one side, the other side, one side, the other side. We'll do Kevin's hot seat next. So with that, we'll put the timer on, and Kevin, get ready for some questions. So the queue is going to be just in the order of hands: Miles, Brian, Noah. So Miles, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for your argument. As we touched on before, I guess I would like to talk more about the logic of how you are going to avoid the worry that the divine psychology objection overgeneralizes and proves too much. And specifically, why it is that you think that ITBE, which I forget now what it stands for, but this infinite ball of energy that talks to you, why you think that is evidence for theism over naturalism. Because I think that'll help to begin to unravel the issues.
Well, I think that it's evidence for theism because you have intersubjective evidence from scientific experts that this violates, the known, all of our laws of nature. So there's no scientific explanation for this sort of event. It's not like a cross in the sky or something like that, which could potentially get a, fairly easy scientific explanation. Then moreover, it talks to you and tells you that it's God and gives you some, predictions and explanations, right? As much as you want, right? As many people want to ask it for predictions, it's happy to do that, right? And so, and it's not just something that shows up once and then leaves. It's, it hangs around. So, I think that the thought was, I could imagine a sequence of events, in this sort of conversation with the impossible ball of energy where I would be convinced that it was God because it hangs out long enough for scientists to check it out. And it has intersubjective evidence and it's multimodal and all of these sorts of things that you would want for objectivity. But then you also get this, it's talking to you, which I think, like I said earlier, I think does bring in a different sort of level or dimension of considerations, because now you've got this semantic consideration about something talking to you and how to interpret it, and you have testimony and all these issues about other minds. I think Burge, this is like a big point in Burge's argument for other minds, and so that's the idea. And if you don't like the example, like the details there, I was just thinking, like, you could put in enough details where I'd be like, okay, fine, I believe you. That was just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that it would be evidence for theism, but the question is whether or not the divine psychology objection can allow that implication. And it seems to me that the reasons you've cited show that ITBE has an extremely low likelihood given naturalism. But it doesn't tell us what the likelihood is given theism. It doesn't tell us that the likelihood is higher given theism. And it seems to me that that's exactly what the divine psychology objection is aiming to do in the fine-tuning context. We grant that fine-tuning is hideously unlikely given naturalism, but we just can't say how likely it is given theism, so fine-tuning is no evidence for theism over naturalism. So why shouldn't we say the same thing in the case of ITBE? That you're right, all of our scientific evidence indicates that it's got a terribly low probability given naturalism, but then how do we say that the likelihood is higher given theism if we can't make even rudimentary claims about what God would be likely to do?
Yeah, so good. I think this is great. I do think that the claim that we can throw numbers on probability claims is a crucial way of explicating our concept, our sort of naive concept of evidence, and that's one way of fleshing out what we think of as a concept of a reason. I'm somewhat skeptical of the idea that we can always explicate any pre-theoretical use of the word or concept of evidence by throwing numbers on probability claims. So, I mean, I'm not as convinced as you are that there's parity there between probability talk and just general evidence talk in the first place. I'm pretty much willing to admit that. I'm pretty much willing to just kind of go with you on that, and then try to focus the main point on the fact that I'm getting testimony from something, and I have a sort of Burge style content preservation. I think that describes how apes like us, for the most part, work, and our communication systems, signal systems work, and I'm following those rules when I agree that when I take and believe that the thing is God when it tells me it's God. I mean, I think that brings in a different element to the argument, like I said. So yeah, if I can't make the claim that there's a difference between assuming a probability in your argument for the existence of God, like a fine-tuning argument, right? So you make claims about about these probability claims, and then we get this argument that that God exists. But then the justifications for those probability claims, if those depend on psychology or divine psychology, any God would be more likely to do blah than blah. Like for you, it's realize that life has objective value, and then create things that have objective value. Well, there, we're assuming that God has all these rationality features that go beyond the conception, and that's really costly. It might work here if you just define that God that way. Then then maybe you're getting something closer to a decent argument. But then the other arguments fall apart, right? Ontological arguments not going to give you the right conclusion, and so on. So yeah, all this is just going to say, I think that there's a difference between me saying there's the impossible ball of light, it talks to me, I believe it, it convinced me that it's God, I believe in God, and saying something like God is more likely to create, or God is more likely to follow or pursue objective value than not. life's higher objective value, and so on, right? That brings in the divine psychology at the beginning in a way that the argument I gave for my own personal belief in God and the possible ball of light hypothetical situation does not.
Perfect. We'll go to Brian next.
Thanks. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that like it would be foolish for the theist to make confident pronouncements about divine psychology and to confidently proclaim like if there's a God, definitely he would create conscious embodied life, or he would very likely prefer realizing objective value over not, or whatever. But I want to emphasize like just how modest the divine psychology claims need to be in order to run some of these arguments. So, if you take the fine-tuning argument, if you look at like some of the numbers people throw around when they're talking about the science of fine-tuning, they'll say things like, well, the chances that the constant would be in the life-permitting range by chance or given naturalism is like 1/10 to the 120th or something. Okay, and now in order for this to be evidence for theism, I just need it to be more likely than 1/10 to the 120th conditional on theism that God would want to create conscious embodied life. And so, I don't need to say probably or it's even moderately likely that God would do that, but just that like it wouldn't be unreasonable to assign that a value of more than 1 in a trillion that God would have some interest in creating conscious embodied life. Like that seems to me like a very, very modest claim about what an all-powerful, all-good God would want. And it's enough for the evidence to be many, many, many orders of magnitude higher on theism than on atheism. I mean, of course, we could question the exact numbers here and get into the science of fine-tuning, but if these numbers are right, then like you can rely on just extremely minimal, extremely modest claims about what a good God like might do, in the sense of like there's at least a 1 in a trillion chance or 1 in a trillion chance that God would be interested in doing something like that. And like so I guess I want to know like is it unreasonable to rely on divine psychology claims that are even at that level of modesty?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Short answer, yes. I agree with you. It is super modest. I agree with you. It is enough for the theist, and it's still unjustified.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any reason to think that, any God at all would be, more likely to do X than Y, for any, X or Y.
All right, Noah, for the last question.
So, on that topic, I wonder what you think of the argument I gave in my opening speech, that we can justify at least some modest expectations about God's behavior just by unpacking the notion of a limitless agent. I agree with Brian that we shouldn't be confident for any X that God would do X, unless X is like sufficiently abstract. But I do think just by unpacking the notion of an agent, we can know that God is more likely to bring about states of affairs for which we can imagine reasons than an impersonal force that's indifferent to reasons.
Yeah, good. I think that's I think this is a totally natural way to go, would be to look for minimal definitions of God that will actually get you divine psychology as part of the definition, or how to like pull divine psychology claims out of the definition of God that you're working with. I think that's a totally reasonable strategy. My worries about it, the organism example analogy that you gave, I don't think is a good analogy for the following reasons. Organism is a technical term in a scientific theory that's emerged over a period of time in response to a ton of empirical evidence, and so I don't think we have anything like that for God. And you're totally right. Organisms, do X is something that's reasonable to conclude from our definition of organism in that scientific theory. You're totally right about that. But I just don't think you can get the same thing for, God would do X in the same way. Now, let's say you could get God would do X in the same way, like you want to get, from this definition. Okay. Well, I think then, like I said, there's a number of worries about other arguments for the existence of God, right? The other arguments for the existence of God, if they prove something that doesn't satisfy that, extra bit, then they're not going to be sufficient now, right? So there's a sort of holistic worry for the theist. But even deeper than that, I mean, we're using conceptual analysis to bring these sorts of consequences out of our concept of God or agent or whatever it is. That's putting a whole lot of trust in those human concepts. And from my perspective, that's not super warranted. Plenty of our concepts are a disaster, defective, all kinds of problems with them, right? And so trying to just draw out any particular consequence from them, I mean, look how many philosophical paradoxes there are, they're all over the place. And so, this is an idiosyncratic view, I'm granting you. Lots of concepts are defective. I'm willing to grant it. That's idiosyncratic. I don't think you should just believe that, right? Take that with a grain of salt. But it's still a concern for what you're doing. And it would be reasonable for you to say something about why you think those concepts are good ones and not bad ones like phlogiston or whatever.
All right, perfect. So now we will transition to Noah's hot seat, much anticipated.
Could I actually... Well, I think it actually might be good to start by saying something about Kevin's concerns with the organism analogy. Could I start there? Okay, great. So, what I want to claim is that you can derive some modest expectations about how an organism would behave just by unpacking the notion of an organism. And I think you could do that even if you didn't have empirical evidence that organisms exist or had observed any organisms. So let's say you have Bayesian's super baby who just comes into the world, hasn't gotten any evidence yet. They just have, an objective prior probability. And someone hands Bayesian's super baby a textbook about biology, but only gives them the page where the notion of an organism is explicated. So they're not reading any bits of the book that give evidence for the existence of organisms. They're just trying to grasp what an organism is. I think that once Bayesian's super baby understands what an organism is, they can already have some reasonable, modest expectations about what reality is going to look like if there are organisms in it. And so, Bayesian super baby can leave his Bayesian super crib and go outside and look around, and he sees, oh, there are some cohesive objects that seem like they're running for shelter or gathering food and reproducing and so on and so forth. This seems like it fits the notion of an organism that I read in the textbook. I'm going to update on this evidence and become more confident that there are organisms. So I'm envisioning something similar in the case of theism. We just stipulate that theism is the hypothesis that the fundamental reality is a limitless agent. And just by unpacking the notion of an agent, we can form some reasonable, though modest, expectations about the way reality will be if that agent exists. And we can work with that going forward. But again, I want to emphasize, I agree with Brian that it's not the theist's burden to show that we can derive just from the notion of a limitless agent that God likely would, say, fine-tune the universe. All we have to show is that a limitless agent is more likely to do that than an impersonal fundamental thing, like the sort of thing the naturalist is going to posit at the foundation.
If I could just ask the first question before Miles goes ahead. So do you agree that the concept of an organism is coherent? That it's kind of uncontroversial that the concept of an organism is coherent?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it's controversial, similarly uncontroversial, that the notion of God is coherent or incoherent?
It's controversial. I don't know that it should be. I don't find any of the arguments for the incoherence of theism persuasive.
Yeah, but all that I need to say is that you're like, oh well, we're going to analyze the property, we're going to analyze the things about God, and then once we analyze the various traits, then we're gonna get the expectation. But it seems like now what's generating the expectation, you're outsourcing the justification for divine psychology on whether or not theism is coherent or not. And if any of those incoherence arguments works, then it's just like kind of game over.
Well, I think
But then again, that would show that theism is false. But I mean, now we're talking about whether or not theism is a coherent notion, or like whether or not Swinburne's deduction works in the way that you want it to.
right.
And then that's going to ratchet up certain things that you might have to now defend.
Yeah, so I think offering theistic arguments is one thing, answering atheistic arguments is another. So if you had an argument for thinking the concept of God was incoherent, that's an atheistic argument that I'm going to need to answer. But suppose I answer it, then I think I can still get the modest expectations that I need in order to run my evidential arguments for theism.
Okay, good. So let's say that we agree that God is unlimited good with respect to his moral perfection. So do you think that moral reasons are like requiring reasons, like that they would impel God to act in a particular kind of way, and he would perforce be required to act in that way?
I think it would have been morally permissible for God to do nothing. So I don't want to say that any moral reasons require that he create.
Sure.
But there
So it's
might
be
be
permit.
but there might be moral reasons that require him not to do certain things. Like he might be morally required not to create a world where everyone is just tortured unjustly for eternity. So I don't think God's morally required to create, but I'm open to the idea that there are certain creations he's morally required not to create.
Okay. So he isn't morally required to create. You agree with that? So then how likely is it, if you could do the calculation, how likely is it that he would create them? If you're agreeing that there's no expectation that he would create. He could just bask in his eternal glory.
Well, I don't think that I can give you a precise number, but I can think of lots of reasons to create. One reason is so that God can manifest certain of his attributes, certain of his virtues. So, on my view, God is gracious. He wants to shower unmerited favor on creatures, but of course, well, he wants to shower unmerited favor on someone, and he can't shower unmerited favor on himself because he's perfect. So any favor he receives, he merits. So he's going to have to create some imperfect beings for the sake of showing them grace. I'm just giving an example. There are like 1,000 reasons I think you could give. And all this shows is that it's not terribly unlikely that God would create the universe. And again, I don't think the theist has the burden. Well, first of all, I mean, I haven't really appealed to a cosmological argument, so I don't think I even have the burden to show that the existence of the physical world is greater given theism than given atheism. But suppose I wanted to make a cosmological argument, all I would have to show is the weaker claim that there's more likely to be a physical universe if God exists than if he doesn't. Nathan, are you muted? I think you're muted.
Yeah, apologies for that. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, that was my mistake. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay. Are we well placed to determine, without appealing to special revelation, how God weighs his agent neutral reasons for action, just because we're in the realm of natural theology as opposed to special revelation revelatory arguments for God's existence? So are we well placed to know those things, how he weighs the agent neutral reasons for action?
It depends on what you mean by well placed to know. I don't think that bare theism leads to really strong expectations about what God would do, as I mentioned earlier. But I do think, again, it can give us expectations that are modest enough that evidential arguments for theism have a lot of force. So like in Brian's case, I don't know how likely God, sort of barely conceived, would be to fine-tune the universe, but I'm pretty sure it's a lot higher than 1 in 10 to the power of 120. And so I still think the fine-tuning argument's going to have a lot of force, even if I'm not in a position in any given case to say what God's reasons favor on balance.
Right, but in order to say that it's more likely on theism than it is on naturalism, you should think that, whatever God's reasons are, make it more likely, but it seems like what you're saying is that I don't know how likely it is on theism per se, because you can't investigate how God weighs his agent neutral reasons for action. But then I know it's more likely than the potentially extremely long list of disjunctive naturalist hypotheses. So it's a little bit weird that you're doing these types of likelihoods, and then you're just saying, well, on the other hand, and I'm going to do something I did in the last 10, it's like free-form jazz on the other one side, and then it's classical music on the other, right? We're just kind of improving with the probabilities on one side, and then the other, you're going down to the last decimal point. And I'm wondering what exactly makes that not a suspicious move.
Well, I think we engage in this sort of reasoning all the time in ordinary contexts. What's the probability that Miles is going to walk out this evening and order a pint? I don't know. I couldn't put a number on that. I don't know what Miles' drinking habits are. I don't even know if he drinks. But here's something I'm very confident of. Miles is more likely to go buy a pint than his microphone is. Why? Because microphones don't buy pints. So, and similarly, I could go with some other organism, like maybe there's a mouse in his cupboard. I think he's more likely to go out and order a pint than the mouse is. So I think these likelihood comparisons are much easier to make than precise judgments about likelihoods. And I think the sort of line you're pressing would basically just prevent us from engaging in the reasoning that makes ordinary life possible.
I appreciate shaking things up. But yeah, so what I want to press.
If the time is running out, can I jump in to get a question?
Running out. Sorry, I was getting lost in the sauce, but the sauce is a great place to get lost. Yeah, if Kevin has any remaining thoughts, we'll go to Kevin.
Do you mean Miles?
Oh, well, no. If Kevin has any questions, if you have any questions for Noah, but like a remaining one, unless like. We have no time for that, but
no, I was the one who had asked to ask a question.
Oh yeah, Miles. Yeah, Miles. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, all I wanted to say was just a bit of friendly fire, because it seems to me the argument you're making is that like the hypothesis of agency seems to make it non-negligibly likely that we'd have, say, for example, like a universe with life, because we can identify a reason there, create a universe with life. Life is a understandable reason. It's non-negligibly likely given agency just by definition of what an agent is. But I thought that under a suitably fine-grained analysis of reason, the space of possible reasons in the fine-tuning example, for instance, seems to be isomorphic to all possible values of the constants. I mean, at some level, like, you could just say a reason here might be that God or an agent designed the universe to set the cosmological constant just outside the life-permitting range. And that's a reason. And if you allow that, well, then you can see that for any combination of values of the constants, you could just say the reason the agent designed the universe was to get that combination of values, in which case the likelihood of life is extremely low still. So I guess I just wanted to hear more about what constitutes a reason on your view.
Good. So I think reasons are at least to some extent objective. I think there are objective reasons out there to act and not to act. And this is a majority view among contemporary analytic philosophers, even though they're largely sympathetic to atheism. And notably, I think all I need to get these modest expectations is the claim that it's reasonably likely that some values are objective. Because then I can just take theism, combine it with this view that some reasons are objective, and the resulting hypothesis is going to have a reasonably high prior probability, and then I can get a bunch of evidence for that conjunction. So with that part in place, now the fact that the agent in question is limitless becomes important. If this agent is limitless, it's going to know about all the objective reasons there are. And going back to a point Brian made earlier, we can ask the question, which of the reasons, the objective ones, is this agent going to be sensitive to? The simplest answer is all of them. And I claim that an agent who knows about and is sensitive to all of the objective reasons is going to favor good outcomes over bad ones. I mean, now essentially what we're talking about is a morally perfect being, a being who always does what there's most reason, objectively speaking, to do. So with that said, I think although there are infinitely many conceivable sets of reasons that a limitless agent could have, I don't think that all of those sets of reasons are equally likely. I think there's one that stands out, namely the hypothesis that the agent in question is sensitive to all of the objective reasons. Maybe all and only the objective reasons, because if we add that there are some additional reasons the agent has, now we're sort of complicating the hypothesis. This isn't original to me. This is a point that Richard Swinburne makes, which is if we're going to say that the agent at the fundamental layer of reality departs from what it objectively should do, we're going to have to posit that it has some desires that sort of factor into the equation, and adding desires to the fundamental agent is gonna be less parsimonious. So, and the more of those we add, the less parsimony it's gonna be. So in general, I think we should favor versions of theism according to which the bulk of what determines what God does are the objective reasons he has.
First of all, yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in. This has been a really fruitful debate. I think not only have we enjoyed it, but we hope you enjoyed it. And I just want to thank everybody who came to participate in the debate for their time. These are really heavy hitters, and it's a really wonderful opportunity for us to get together and discuss really important questions in the philosophy of religion. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you. Cool. Thanks for organizing.
Thanks everyone.